Welcome to Crime Bedtime. True crime stories to fall asleep to. Before we dive into tonight's cases, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from. Now get comfortable. And let's begin. Story 1. The Murder of Serena McKay. On April 23, 2017, the Manitoba RCMP received a troubling report that would soon unravel one of the most disturbing cases the region had seen in years. It started when officers from the Easterville Detachment were called to a wooded area on the Sagking First Nation, roughly 100 kilometers northeast of Winnipeg. What they found there was the lifeless body of a young woman, beaten beyond recognition. The crime scene was grim, and it was clear from the start that this had not been an accident. The brutality was immediate and shocking. The body was soon identified as Serena McKay, an Indigenous woman just days away from her 18th birthday. She was a student at Sagking Anishinaabe High School and had recently moved to the area. Serena had been reported missing only several hours earlier, late on April 23rd. Her disappearance had not initially raised alarm, as it wasn't uncommon for teens in the area to stay with friends without checking in. But the condition of her body told a different story. This wasn't a case of a runaway or a tragic accident. This was homicide. The RCMP launched an investigation with urgency, but in the early hours they had no suspects and no witnesses. That changed quickly. On April 24th, just a day after Serena's body was found, two disturbing videos began circulating on Facebook. The footage showed a young woman being violently assaulted by two other girls. The attack was prolonged, and the victim was repeatedly kicked and punched in the head and face. She was barely conscious, unable to defend herself. Although the footage was blurry and appeared to be filmed in low light, some community members recognized the individuals involved. Within hours, the videos were sent to authorities. Investigators confirmed that the girl in the video was Serena McKay. The footage captured the final moments of her life. Officers were able to identify the two girls seen in the videos. Both were under the age of 18, which meant their identities were protected by Canada's Youth Criminal Justice Act. One of the girls, 16 years old at the time, was arrested and charged with second-degree murder. The other girl, also underage, was arrested shortly after. The RCMP did not release many details initially, citing the ongoing investigation and the legal protections surrounding youth offenders. Serena's death sent shockwaves through the community, not just because of its brutality, but because it had been filmed and shared on social media. The Sagking First Nation, already dealing with the challenges of youth violence and substance abuse, was now grappling with the reality that a teenager had been murdered by her peers and that others had watched it happen online in real time. At a press conference, RCMP spokesperson Sergeant Paul Menager confirmed that the video was authentic and that it had shown a portion of the assault that resulted in the death of Serena McKay. He urged people not to share the video out of respect for the victim and her family. But by then, it had already been viewed and shared thousands of times, both inside the community and beyond. The internet had made the violence impossible to contain. In the early days of the investigation, police put together a timeline of Serena's final hours. She had attended a house party in Sagking on the night of April 22nd. Witnesses confirmed she was drinking and socializing with others, including the two girls later arrested for her murder. At some point, an argument broke out. By the time Serena left the party, she was visibly intoxicated. The assault seen in the video appeared to take place shortly after that. Autopsy results would later confirm the extent of the violence. Serena had suffered extensive blunt force trauma to her head and face. There were multiple lacerations, bruises, and fractures. The medical examiner concluded that she had died from her injuries sometime between the night of April 22nd and the early morning hours of April 23rd. The level of violence suggested a sustained, rage-filled attack. As the case unfolded, the RCMP confirmed that the two suspects knew Serena. They had all been classmates at Sagking Anishinaabe High School. The motive was still unclear, but police believed alcohol and possibly other substances had played a role in escalating the conflict. According to investigators, the girls had not planned Serena's murder in advance. Instead, it appeared to be a spontaneous act of violence that spiraled out of control. In the weeks that followed, The community held vigils and ceremonies to remember Serena. Her family, devastated by the senseless loss, called for justice and accountability. They also spoke out about the impact of violence in indigenous communities and the lack of adequate support for youth. Serena's mother, Dolores Daniels, described her daughter as kind, funny, and full of potential. She had dreams of becoming a social worker, someone who could help others escape the very cycle of violence that took her own life. As more evidence came to light, investigators pieced together that the assault had occurred just a short distance from where Serena's body was later found. The girls had dragged or carried her into the woods after the attack, leaving her to die alone. It was an act not only of violence but of utter disregard for life. The presence of video evidence made the case unusual. In most homicide investigations, proving guilt relies on witness testimony, forensic evidence, and circumstantial connections. But here, the violence had been documented, filmed by one of the perpetrators, and posted online. The RCMP confirmed the video's authenticity through digital forensics and used it as central evidence in the upcoming legal proceedings. Because the suspects were underage, the question of whether they would be tried as adults became a central issue. Under Canadian law, youth can be sentenced as adults in certain serious cases, including murder. The Crown would need to apply for an adult sentence, and a judge would weigh the circumstances, including the severity of the crime and the rehabilitation potential of the accused. Meanwhile, the Sagkeeng First Nation continued to mourn. The case raised broader questions about youth violence, the impact of social media, and the systemic issues that continue to affect Indigenous communities across Canada. Serena's death was not an isolated incident. It was part of a much larger pattern of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls whose cases have too often been overlooked or minimized. But this time, the violence had been captured in real time. It could not be denied, ignored, or forgotten. In the days following Serena McKay's killing, the RCMP began processing the crime scene in Sagkeeng First Nation with painstaking care. The wooded area where her body was discovered presented a number of challenges. It was remote, shadowed by thick brush, and the ground was soft with thawing spring soil. Forensic officers moved slowly, collecting blood samples, disturbed vegetation, and any trace evidence they could recover. They knew the video that had surfaced offered a disturbing glimpse of the attack, but it was the physical evidence that would ultimately support a murder charge in court. Investigators believed the assault had taken place near a residence along Pine Street, near the school Serena had been attending. The home was associated with one of the accused girls. The RCMP obtained a search warrant and combed the property for evidence, photographing every room, every item that looked out of place. Inside, they found bloodstains consistent with the injuries seen in the video footage. Samples were taken and DNA testing later confirmed they belonged to Serena. The house, which had been used by teenagers to gather and drink, was in disarray. Empty bottles, cigarette butts, and scattered clothing painted a picture of a chaotic night. The RCMP also recovered the cell phone used to record the assault. It belonged to one of the two female youths who were subsequently charged. Digital forensic analysis would reveal not only the original video files, but also deleted content, search history, and messages exchanged in the hours before and after the attack. The digital evidence was damning. The messages recovered from the phone showed that tensions had been building between Serena and one of the girls in the days leading up to the assault. There were arguments over social circles, romantic interests, and perceived slights, typical teenage conflicts, but ones that had begun to take on a darker edge. Investigators noted that the tone of the messages became increasingly hostile, with threats and confrontational language escalating just hours before the party. A forensic pathologist from Winnipeg was tasked with conducting the autopsy. The report confirmed what officers had feared: the injuries Serena sustained were extensive and inflicted over a sustained period. She had deep lacerations to her scalp and face, severe bruising on her upper body, and multiple fractures, including a broken jaw and orbital bones. Toxicology results also showed a high blood alcohol concentration, which likely left her unable to defend herself or flee during the attack. The cause of death was listed as blunt force trauma with complications from exposure, suggesting Serena may have still been alive when she was left outside. Following the arrest of the two girls, Crown prosecutors began preparing their case. The older of the two was charged with second-degree murder. The younger girl, initially apprehended as a possible participant, was eventually released without charges. The RCMP later confirmed that only one of the girls would stand trial. Because she was 16 at the time, her identity was protected under the Youth Criminal Justice Act, though the Crown announced its intention to seek an adult sentence due to the severity of the crime. The courtroom proceedings began in late 2017 and were closed to the public due to the accused age. However, key details were later made available through court records. The girl pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in December of that year, sparing Serena's family the pain of a drawn-out trial. During sentencing submissions, the Crown laid out the evidence in detail, including the full contents of the video, witness testimony from those at the party, and the results of the forensic investigation. In victim impact statements submitted to the court, Serena's family described the profound emotional trauma they endured in the aftermath. Her mother, Dolores Daniels, spoke about the nightmares, the anxiety, and the overwhelming grief that had overtaken their lives. She also addressed the fact that the video of Serena's final moments had been shared widely on social media, a violation that added a layer of cruelty to an already unbearable loss. The girl's defense team submitted psychological assessments, arguing that she had been under the influence of alcohol and struggling with unresolved trauma of her own. A clinical psychologist testified that the accused had symptoms consistent with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder and that her cognitive development had been delayed. These factors, they argued, made her less culpable and more amenable to rehabilitation. The defense acknowledged the brutality of the crime but urged the court to consider a youth sentence, citing the girl's age and prospects for reform. Justice Rocky Pollock of the Manitoba Provincial Court ultimately delivered his decision in July 2018. He agreed with the Crown that the murder warranted an adult sentence. In his ruling, he acknowledged the girl's difficult upbringing and the challenges she faced, but concluded that the nature of the crime, its violence, its documentation, and its impact demanded a sentence that reflected societal condemnation. She was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 7 years, the maximum adult sentence under Canadian law for a youth offender convicted of second-degree murder. The decision was met with mixed reactions. While some in the community viewed the adult sentence as a necessary measure of accountability, others questioned whether the justice system had done enough to address the underlying causes that led to such a tragedy. Indigenous leaders pointed to the broader context, a legacy of intergenerational trauma, systemic neglect, and the continued marginalization of Indigenous youth in Canada. In the months that followed, Serena's family became increasingly vocal about the need for change. They participated in public forums, spoke to media outlets, and called for reforms to the way youth violence is addressed in Indigenous communities. They also advocated for greater mental health support, culturally appropriate programming, and stricter controls on social media platforms where violent content can spread unchecked. A year after Serena's death, the Sagking First Nation held a memorial ceremony in her honor. Elders, community members, and students gathered to remember her life and to reflect on what had been lost. A sacred fire was lit, and traditional drumming filled the air as people offered prayers and shared stories. For those who had known Serena, it was a moment of healing, but also a reminder that the pain of her death had not faded. The incident also prompted broader conversations across Canada about the role of social media in youth violence. Several school divisions in Manitoba began introducing digital literacy programs aimed at teaching students about consent, privacy, and the consequences of sharing graphic content. The RCMP issued public statements warning about the legal risks of circulating videos involving criminal acts, particularly when minors are involved. In the wake of the case, Manitoba's Office of the Children's Advocate launched a review into the circumstances surrounding Serena's death. The office examined the support services available to her, the history of intervention by child welfare agencies, and the systemic gaps that may have contributed to the tragedy. The final report, released in 2019, identified multiple areas where the system had failed to provide adequate care, including inconsistent access to counseling, poor coordination between agencies, and a lack of culturally grounded supports for at-risk youth. The report did not assign blame to any one individual or agency, but it painted a stark picture of a young woman who had been left vulnerable by a fractured system. In response, the Children's Advocate issued several recommendations, including increased funding for mental health programs, better training for frontline workers, and the expansion of culturally relevant services in First Nations communities across Manitoba. Serena McKay's murder was not just a horrifying act of violence, it was a mirror held up to a series of institutional failures, each one compounding the other. Her death forced a reckoning with uncomfortable truths about how society treats its most vulnerable members, especially Indigenous women and girls. And though justice was formally served in the courtroom, the deeper questions raised by her killing remain open, unresolved. What happened in that house on Pine Street and in the forest beyond was not just the result of teenage conflict or impaired judgment. It was the end of a chain of neglect, broken trust, and lost opportunity, and the beginning of a collective demand for something better. In the months that followed the sentencing of the 16-year-old girl who pleaded guilty to the murder of Serena McKay, Manitoba authorities and advocacy groups turned their attention toward the deeper failures that made such a tragedy possible. The response extended beyond the courtroom toward public policy, education, and systemic supports that had long been inadequate, particularly for Indigenous youth in rural communities. The Manitoba Advocate for Children and Youth, then led by Daphne Penrose, initiated a formal investigation into the circumstances surrounding Serena's life and death. Known as a special report, it was released publicly in March of 2019 under the title, A Place Where It Feels Like Home. The report did not focus solely on the events of April 2017. Instead, it traced Serena's life through the lens of the child welfare and education systems, examining the services she received and those she did not. The findings were unsettling. According to the Advocate's investigation, Serena had been involved with Manitoba's child welfare system from a young age. She had been placed in care multiple times and moved through a series of foster homes and placements. The report stated that she had experienced at least 80 official interactions with child and family services agencies throughout her life. Many of these involved assessments, placements, and safety concerns. The level of instability was high, and consistent support was markedly absent. The report revealed that during critical periods of Serena's adolescence, she was bounced between homes and communities, including time spent in Winnipeg and back in Sagkeeng. This instability disrupted her schooling, her relationships, and access to mental health services. At times, she was placed in group homes with older youth, some of whom had complex behavioral issues. According to the Advocate's findings, these placements often lacked the structure or cultural grounding that might have helped Serena build a sense of stability or belonging. The review also identified gaps in interagency communication. Schools, child welfare agencies, and health services did not always share information effectively, resulting in missed opportunities to intervene when Serena's needs escalated. In one instance, a school administrator flagged concerns about Serena's declining attendance and emotional well-being, but those concerns were never followed up with a coordinated care plan. Another service provider noted a risk of substance misuse, but no long-term strategy was implemented. One of the report's most pressing observations was the lack of culturally relevant programming. Serena was identified as someone who felt strongly connected to her Indigenous identity. She participated in traditional ceremonies and wanted to learn more about her language and heritage. Yet, despite this, many of the environments she was placed in offered few, if any, cultural supports. According to the Advocate's report, this left Serena feeling isolated. She told a caseworker during one intake that she just wanted to feel like she belonged somewhere. The Advocate's office issued 5 concrete recommendations. These included the creation of a province-wide youth transition protocol, enhanced data sharing between agencies, and mandatory cultural programming for Indigenous youth in care. The goal was to prevent other children from falling through the same cracks Serena had. The recommendations were submitted to the Manitoba government and local child welfare authorities. In the months that followed, some agencies began implementing new training modules, but broader systemic reform remained slow. The Sagkeeng First Nation, still mourning the loss of one of their own, launched their own initiatives. Community leaders began working with elders and educators to create safe spaces for youth. The local high school, where Serena had been a student, introduced peer mentorship programs, and partnered with outside organizations to expand access to mental health services. Funding remained a challenge, but the intention was clear: to make sure young people did not have to navigate trauma alone. In Winnipeg, Indigenous women's advocacy groups continued to push for structural change. Serena's death became a touchpoint in larger national conversations about missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Although Serena was not classified under that designation, many advocates argued that her case shared the same root causes: systemic discrimination, lack of culturally competent care, and the failure of institutions to protect vulnerable Indigenous youth. Serena's family participated in several public forums and community gatherings. At one roundtable hosted by the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs, her mother, Dolores Daniels, spoke quietly but firmly about the need for accountability not just in the legal system, but in child welfare, education, and health care. She emphasized that Serena had not been a statistic, but a child with dreams and potential. She wanted to be a social worker, to help others who had experienced the same instability she had. In the years following Serena's death, the spread of the assault video remained a painful reminder of how quickly violence could be amplified online. The RCMP and local school divisions began addressing digital safety with greater urgency. Presentations were delivered in schools across Manitoba focusing on the dangers of recording and sharing violent content. Law enforcement emphasized that possessing or distributing such material even passively could result in criminal charges, particularly when youth were involved. In 2018, Facebook confirmed it had removed the video from its platform after being contacted by Canadian authorities. However, by then, the damage had been done. The video had circulated widely, and even with removal efforts, fragments continued to resurface in dark corners of the internet. Privacy experts and Indigenous advocates called for clearer guidelines and faster response protocols from tech companies when violent content involving minors appeared online. In response, the federal government began engaging with social media platforms to address the broader issue of online harm. While no legislation was passed directly because of Serena's case, her death contributed to a growing awareness of the need for more responsive digital policies, particularly when young people are the victims. By 2020, the girl who had pleaded guilty to Serena's murder remained incarcerated. Under Canadian law, she was eligible to apply for parole after 7 years. The sentence, though the maximum for a youth convicted as an adult, remained controversial. Some believed the possibility of early release did not reflect the depth of the crime. Others pointed to the girl's own history of trauma, arguing that rehabilitation should not be dismissed. The parole process, when it arrives, will consider a range of factors: psychological evaluations, behavior during incarceration, and the risk of reoffending. The victim's family will be allowed to submit impact statements, and the community will have the opportunity to weigh in. Until then, the sentence stands a legal resolution, though not an emotional one. Serena McKay's grave in Sagking is visited often by family and friends. Her headstone is simple, engraved with her name and the dates that mark her brief life. Nearby, a small garden has been planted. It is tended by local youth as part of a community healing project, a living reminder of Serena's presence and of the lessons her death left behind. Over time, the headlines faded. The court proceedings concluded. The news cycle moved on. But for those who knew Serena, and for those who saw the video and could not forget it, the grief remains. The systems that surrounded Serena did not fail in one single moment. They failed over years through inattention, through bureaucracy, through silence. Her death was not inevitable, but it was made possible by a lack of care that had gone unchallenged for too long. And now, in the stillness that follows, her story continues to echo in classrooms, in courtrooms, in policy rooms. A quiet plea not just for justice, but for change. Story 2. The Casey Anthony Trial. On July 15, 2008, a call came into the Orange County Sheriff's Office in Florida. The voice on the line belonged to Cindy Anthony, who sounded panicked and overwhelmed. She told the dispatcher that her granddaughter, 2-year-old Kaylee Marie Anthony, had been missing for 31 days. She also stated that her daughter, Casey Anthony, had just admitted that Kaylee was gone. "My daughter finally admitted that the baby is missing," Cindy said. I found my daughter's car today, and it smells like there's been a dead body in the damn car. That specific detail, the smell, would soon become one of the most pivotal and controversial elements in what would become one of the most widely followed criminal trials in American history. When deputies arrived at the Anthony home in East Orange County that evening, they were met by 22-year-old Casey Anthony, who calmly told them that Kaylee had been kidnapped. She claimed that her nanny, a woman named Zenaida Fernandez Gonzalez, had taken Kaylee on June 9th while Casey was at work. According to Casey, she had been trying to find Kaylee herself for the past month out of fear and denial, but now she said she was ready to involve law enforcement. Investigators were immediately suspicious. There was no record of anyone named Zenaida Fernandez Gonzalez ever being employed by the Anthony family. Casey couldn't provide a working phone number or a valid address for the woman, and her story kept shifting. She said she had left Kaylee with Zenaida at Sawgrass Apartments. But when detectives checked, no one by that name had ever lived there. Surveillance footage didn't place Casey or Kaylee at the complex that day. Detective Yuri Melik was assigned to lead the investigation and quickly noticed inconsistencies in Casey's statements. The very next day, on July 16th, Casey was arrested for child neglect, giving false statements, and obstruction of a criminal investigation. She was held without bond. Inside her Pontiac Sunfire, forensic investigators found a number of items that raised concern. The most notable were a stained piece of carpet in the trunk, a trash bag, and the overwhelming smell of decomposition. Cadaver dogs alerted to the trunk of the car. Air sample tests conducted by Dr. Arpid Vass of the Oak Ridge National Laboratory later indicated the presence of chemical compounds consistent with a decomposing human body. These included chloroform levels significantly higher than normal. As the search for Kaylee continued, the public became increasingly invested in the case. Media outlets across the country began reporting on the unusual timeline and Casey's behavior. She hadn't reported her daughter missing for over a month. During that time, she had been seen shopping, partying, and even entering a hot body contest at a local nightclub. Investigators also pulled Casey's cell phone and computer records. They found internet searches made on the Anthony home computer for terms like chloroform, neck breaking, and how to make chloroform, all conducted in March of that year, months before Kaylee disappeared. When questioned again about her employment, Casey insisted she worked at Universal Studios. Detectives accompanied her to the park, where she led them through the employee entrance before finally admitting she hadn't worked there in years. As more details emerged, Casey's defense began to take shape. Her attorney, Jose Baez, argued that just because Casey had lied did not mean she had killed her daughter. He suggested that Casey had been deeply traumatized and had been raised in a dysfunctional family where she was taught to lie and hide pain. But at that point, there was no evidence to support that theory. Meanwhile, George and Cindy Anthony, Kaylee's grandparents, made public pleas for their granddaughter's return. They passed out flyers, held vigils, and cooperated with law enforcement. But their support for Casey became increasingly strained as the facts began to contradict her story. On December 11, 2008, 5 months after Kaylee was reported missing, a utility worker named Roy Kronk made a discovery. While relieving himself in a wooded area near the Anthony home, he noticed something unusual, a black garbage bag partially buried under brush. Inside were the skeletal remains of a small child along with a blanket and a canvas laundry bag. The skull had duct tape across the mouth area and hair was still attached to the scalp. The remains were later confirmed to be Kaylee Anthony. The location had been searched previously, but due to heavy flooding in the area during the summer, it's believed the remains had been submerged or obscured. Still, the discovery changed everything. The case was no longer about a missing child, it was a homicide investigation now. The medical examiner, Dr. Jan Garavaglia, could not determine the exact cause of death due to the condition of the remains, but she ruled it a homicide. The presence of duct tape over the mouth and nose pointed to a deliberate act. In the report, she noted the suspicious circumstances and the concealment of the body as factors contributing to the ruling. On October 14, 2008, before Kaylee's body had even been found, Casey was indicted by a grand jury on 7 counts, including first-degree murder, aggravated child abuse, and aggravated manslaughter of a child. She pleaded not guilty. Prosecutors announced they would seek the death penalty. As the state built its case, they focused on motive. The prosecution argued that Casey wanted the freedom to live her life without the burden of motherhood. They said she had grown tired of her responsibilities and had taken steps to eliminate the obstacle. They pointed to her behavior in the days following Kaylee's disappearance attending parties, getting a tattoo that read Bella Vita, which means beautiful life, and lying to everyone around her. The defense, led by Jose Baez, prepared for a very different strategy. He claimed that Kaylee had died in an accidental drowning in the family pool on June 16th, and that Casey's father, George Anthony, had helped cover it up. He also alleged that George had sexually abused Casey as a child, suggesting that this lifelong trauma explained her detached behavior and her compulsive lying. George Anthony denied the allegations under oath. As emotions ran high, the case moved toward trial. Both legal teams prepared to argue not just the facts, but the character and motivations of everyone involved. By early 2011, a jury was selected from Pinellas County and sequestered for the duration of the trial. The trial of Casey Anthony would begin in May of that year. Cameras were allowed in the courtroom and the proceedings were broadcast live across the country. Millions of viewers tuned in every day. But despite the evidence, the testimonies, and the public outrage, the outcome would shock nearly everyone. The courtroom was silent when the trial of Casey Anthony officially began on May 24, 2011, in Orlando, Florida. The prosecution, led by Assistant State Attorney Linda Drain Burdick, began with a simple but devastating assertion: that Casey had murdered her daughter intentionally, suffocated her with duct tape, and discarded her body in the woods like garbage. But from the very first moments, Jose Baez steered the courtroom in an unexpected direction. He stood before the jurors and told them something they had never heard before. According to Baez, Kaylee Anthony had not been murdered. He claimed she had drowned in the family's above-ground swimming pool on June 16, 2008. He said George Anthony, Casey's father, had found the body and in a panic told Casey they had to cover it up. Then he made a staggering accusation that George had sexually abused Casey as a child and that she had been trained to lie and hide pain from the people closest to her. George Anthony, seated in the courtroom just a few feet away, remained still as Baez continued, but the impact was immediate. The prosecution objected, and the judge, Belvin Perry, instructed the jury that opening statements were not evidence. Still, the seed had been planted. As the trial unfolded, prosecutors called over 90 witnesses. Some were forensic experts, others were friends, co-workers, and members of the Anthony family. Each one contributed another piece of a puzzle that, when laid out in full, painted a picture the state believed was unmistakable. Cindy Anthony was among the first to testify. Her voice trembled as she spoke about her granddaughter's last known day alive. She said that on the morning of June 16th, she had left for work around 7 in the morning. Kaylee was at home with Casey and George. She said that when she returned home that night, neither Casey nor Kaylee were there. When asked directly if she had ever seen Kaylee after that day, she replied quietly, no. George Anthony followed. His testimony was direct and often emotional. He flatly denied ever abusing his daughter. He also denied knowing anything about a drowning. When asked about the days following Kaylee's disappearance, he admitted that Casey's behavior had seemed odd. He said that when he confronted her about where Kaylee was, she would deflect or change the subject. He described a moment when he had received a notice about the Pontiac Sunfire being towed. When he retrieved it from the impound lot in mid-July, he recalled a strong, unmistakable odor coming from the trunk. It reminded me of what a decomposing body smells like, he said. Forensic examination of the car had revealed a hair in the trunk that a state expert, Karen Korsberg-Lowe, said was microscopically similar to Kaylee's and showed signs of post-mortem banding, a darkened portion of the hair shaft that can occur after death. However, she acknowledged that hair analysis could not definitively determine identity or cause of death. Dr. Arpad Vass, a scientist from Oak Ridge National Laboratory, testified next. He had analyzed air samples from the trunk using a process called gas chromatography mass spectrometry. He reported the presence of volatile compounds consistent with human decomposition, including high levels of chloroform, which he referred to as shockingly high. He also cited the presence of fatty acids and other markers associated with decaying tissue. The defense challenged the validity of the science, pointing out that Vasa's methods were largely untested in criminal courts and not peer-reviewed in the context of forensic evidence. Still, the testimony left a lasting impression. Next came computer analyst John Bradley, who had initially worked with the FBI and later independently reviewed the Anthony family's desktop computer. He revealed that someone had used the computer on March 17, 2008, to search for chloroform, how to make chloroform, and household weapons. He also found a search for inhalation and a visit to a site that detailed the use of chloroform as an anesthetic. Later, however, this testimony would be revised. In a post-trial discovery, Bradley acknowledged that the initial analysis had overcounted the number of visits to a specific site. It had appeared to be 84 visits, but was in fact only one. Still, the presence of the search itself remained undisputed. Casey's behavior in the days and weeks following Kaylee's disappearance was examined at length. Amy Heisinger, a former friend of Casey's, testified that Casey had told her she was staying with her nanny, Zenaida, and that Kaylee was with her. She recounted how Casey had taken her to a Target store and used a checkbook stolen from Amy to purchase clothes, groceries, and beer. Tony Lazzaro, Casey's boyfriend during that time, testified as well. He described how Casey had stayed at his apartment for several nights in June and July. He said that during that time, she never mentioned Kaylee being missing and appeared to go about her days normally. He said he had assumed Kaylee was with the nanny. When asked to describe Casey's demeanor during that month, he said she seemed happy. The prosecution introduced photos taken during that time: Casey dancing at Fusion nightclub, smiling with friends, participating in themed parties. They used these images to argue that she was not a frantic, grieving mother, but someone unburdened. The defense, however, countered with their own witnesses. Dr. William Rodriguez, a forensic anthropologist, testified that the duct tape found near Kaylee's skull could not definitively be placed over the mouth at the time of death. He said it was just as likely that the tape had been placed on the bag or fallen into place later. Dr. Werner Spitz, a well-known pathologist, criticized the original autopsy conducted by Dr. Jan Garavaglia. He stated that no internal examination of the skull had been done and that the positioning of the duct tape was speculative. He ultimately concluded that the cause of death was undetermined. The defense also called on Dr. Jeffrey Danziger, a forensic psychiatrist who had evaluated Casey. Though his full findings were not presented in open court due to legal limitations, he was permitted to say that Casey showed signs of trauma and long-term psychological distress. Perhaps the most unsettling testimony came from Cindy Anthony once again, this time regarding the internet searches. She claimed she had made the search for chloroform while looking up information about chlorophyll for a gardening project. However, further analysis placed her at work during the time the searches were conducted, according to her employer's records and login data. As the weeks wore on, the jury was asked to reconcile the scientific evidence, the circumstantial patterns, and the deep emotional undercurrents of a family in collapse. The prosecution rested its case on the argument that Casey had used chloroform to sedate Kaylee, placed duct tape over her mouth and nose, and then placed her body in the trunk of her car before disposing of it in a wooded area. They said it was premeditated, calculated, and heartless. The defense, on the other hand, maintained that Kaylee's death had been a tragic accident covered up by a panicked family. They argued that the state had no direct evidence of murder, no eyewitnesses, no DNA, no confession. They said the prosecution had built a theory, not a case. As the trial neared its conclusion, the jury would be left to choose between two starkly different narratives, one rooted in science and suspicion, the other in trauma and secrecy. Neither version offered comfort. Neither brought Kaylee back. On July 5, 2011, the jury in the state of Florida v. Casey Marie Anthony returned to the courtroom after nearly 11 hours of deliberation over the course of 2 days. The gallery was tense and silent. Journalists sat poised with pens and cameras. The Anthony family remained motionless, and across the country, millions of people waited for a verdict they believed was long overdue. The clerk read the decision aloud. On the charge of first-degree murder, not guilty. On the charge of aggravated child abuse, not guilty. on the charge of aggravated manslaughter of a child, not guilty. Casey Anthony was found guilty only on 4 misdemeanor counts of providing false information to law enforcement. The gasps from inside the courtroom were audible, and outside, a crowd that had gathered beneath the Florida sun erupted in disbelief. Chants of justice for Kaylee rang out. But inside the courtroom, Casey broke down in tears, hugging her legal team as Judge Belvin Perry prepared to release the jury from their service. It was one of the most controversial verdicts in American legal history. The jury, which had been sequestered for nearly 7 weeks, later explained their decision in interviews. They said they were deeply disturbed by the child's death and believed Casey bore responsibility for her behavior afterward, but they could not convict her of murder without direct evidence proving how Kaylee had died. There was no eyewitness, no confession, and the cause of death remained officially listed as homicide by undetermined means. The presence of duct tape near the remains, while suggestive, was not enough, they said, to prove premeditated killing beyond a reasonable doubt. Jennifer Ford, one of the jurors, later told ABC News, "I did not say she was innocent. I just said there was not enough evidence." Others echoed that sentiment. They had questions, suspicions, even anger, but under the law, suspicion could not substitute for proof. Judge Perry sentenced Casey to 4 years in jail for lying to police, with credit for time served and good behavior. She was released from the Orange County Jail on July 17, 2011, just 12 days after her acquittal, into the early hours of the morning through a side door while protesters shouted outside. The public response was swift and furious. In the weeks following the verdict, protests continued outside the Anthony family home and in public parks. Online, forums, and social media exploded with outrage. Cable news hosts spent entire broadcasts dissecting what had gone wrong. The case had captured the country's attention in a way few others had, partly because of the disturbing nature of the crime, but also because of the strange disconnect between the horror of the child's death and the image of the young woman who had walked away from it. Several jurors said they believed something had happened to Kaylee and that Casey likely knew more than she admitted, but they were bound to consider only what had been proven in court. In the months following the trial, Judge Perry, who had presided over the courtroom with a calm and meticulous demeanor, issued a statement saying that he believed there was enough evidence to support a conviction for manslaughter. He cited Casey's repeated lies, the disposal of the child's body, and the circumstances surrounding the duct tape. But he, too, emphasized that the jury had followed their instruction under the law. The fallout extended beyond the courtroom. Prosecutor Jeff Ashton, who had worked passionately on the case, retired from the state attorney's office shortly after the trial and later ran for state attorney in Orange and Osceola counties, a race he won in 2012. He wrote a book titled Imperfect Justice, prosecuting Casey Anthony, offering a detailed account of the state's case and his reflections on the verdict. Jose Baez, Casey's lead defense attorney, became a household name overnight. His performance in court, once criticized for being unconventional, was now hailed by some as masterful. He published his own book, Presumed Guilty, in which he defended the strategy used during the trial and offered his version of the events. In it, he reiterated claims of family dysfunction and trauma, though much of it remained uncorroborated outside of Casey's own statements. George and Cindy Anthony, whose roles in the trial had been both central and tragic, largely withdrew from public view after the verdict. In later interviews, Cindy expressed that she still believed Kaylee had drowned accidentally and continued to defend her daughter's innocence. George, in contrast, maintained that he did not know what had happened to his granddaughter but did not support the claims made about him during the trial. The tension between the parents and their daughter remained strained and unresolved. In the years that followed, legal battles continued in the form of civil suits. One of the most prominent was brought by Zenaida Fernandez Gonzalez, the woman whose name Casey had given as the fictional nanny. The real Zenaida had no connection to the Anthony family and claimed that her reputation and life had been destroyed by Casey's false accusation. She filed a defamation lawsuit seeking damages. The suit dragged on for years and was ultimately dismissed in 2016 when both parties agreed to drop the case. Casey Anthony herself remained largely hidden from public life. For several years, her whereabouts were unknown, though she was occasionally photographed by paparazzi. In 2016, she was reported to be living in West Palm Beach, Florida, working for a private investigator who had once been part of her defense team. In 2017, she gave her first public interview to the Associated Press. During the brief exchange, she said, "I don't give a SHT about what anyone thinks about me, I never will." She insisted she still did not know what happened to Kaylee and admitted that even now, she struggled to reconcile the facts with her emotions. "I'm still not even certain as I stand here today about what happened," she said. The case prompted legislative changes in several states. One of the most prominent was the push for what became known as Kaylee's Law, a statute that would make it a felony for a parent or guardian to fail to report a missing child in a timely manner. In Florida and other states, versions of the law were passed in the years after the trial, reflecting a widespread belief that justice had not been served and that systems needed to be strengthened to prevent similar tragedies. By the end of that year, the remains of Kaylee Marie Anthony had been cremated and her ashes were kept by the Anthony family. No public memorial was held at the family's request, and the exact location where her ashes were eventually laid to rest has never been disclosed. The trial left behind a fractured family, a grieving nation, and a justice system under scrutiny. For all the evidence, all the testimony, and all the coverage, the core question, what truly happened to Kaylee, remained unanswered. There was no confession, no definitive cause of death, and no closure for those who had followed the case with heavy hearts. The image of a smiling toddler, eyes wide, cheeks round, hair tucked behind her ears, was etched into the public memory. Her short life had become the center of a legal storm, and her death a symbol of something far more painful, the limits of truth, the weight of doubt, and the ache of a story left unresolved. You and I, we may never know what happened in those final hours of Kaylee Anthony's life. But we do know this. Somewhere in the shadows of a quiet suburban home, a child vanished, and justice, in the eyes of many, never arrived. Story 3. The Murder of Farah Khan. On the morning of February 24, 1999, police in Kent, England received a call from a worried father. Mohammed Khan had not seen his 5-year-old daughter, Farah, since the evening before. He told officers he had dropped her off at her mother's flat in Tavel, near Maidstone, as part of a custody agreement. But now no one was answering the door. When officers arrived at the flat on Hadlow Road, they were met with silence. The curtains were drawn. Neighbors hadn't seen anyone come or go since the night before. Officers forced entry. What they found inside was quiet. Still, but something was off. The flat was unusually tidy, almost staged. Toys were stacked neatly. Clothes folded. There were no signs of a struggle. But there was no sign of Farah either. They soon found Farah's mother, Michelle Riaz, upstairs. She was lying in bed, unresponsive but alive. There were empty pill bottles beside her. It was clear she had attempted suicide. Paramedics were called in, and she was rushed to Maidstone Hospital. Police began a search of the property. Farah's bed was made, untouched. Her school bag was still hanging on the hook by the door. In the kitchen, officers found freshly washed dishes in the sink. Nothing out of place, but no child. As the hours passed, the case shifted from a missing person to something more serious. Police began searching the surrounding area. Helicopters scanned nearby woods. Dogs were brought in, but still no sign of Farah. Later that day, when Michelle regained consciousness at the hospital, detectives tried to speak with her. She was dazed, slow to respond. When asked where Farah was, she looked away. Her answers were vague, inconsistent. At one point, she said Farah was with her father. At another, she claimed she didn't remember. Her behavior raised immediate red flags. By the next morning, police had secured a warrant to search the property more thoroughly. The second search was more invasive. They pulled up carpets, emptied cupboards, and inspected the garden. And then they found something. In the rear garden of the flat, beneath a layer of soil and refuse, police uncovered a bin bag. Inside was the body of a child. She was wrapped in a bed sheet. Forensic testing would later confirm what detectives already suspected: it was Farah Khan. She had been strangled. The murder shocked the local community. Farah was known by neighbors as a bright, polite little girl. She had just started school and loved painting. Her father, Mohammed, had been fighting for shared custody since his separation from Michelle. By all accounts, he was a devoted parent. He had dropped Farah off the previous evening, trusting that she would be safe. The timeline started to come together. CCTV footage showed Michelle walking with Farah the night before. They had gone to a nearby shop. Witnesses said they seemed calm, nothing out of the ordinary. But something changed between that moment and the next morning. Post-mortem results confirmed that Farah had died from manual strangulation. There were no signs of sexual assault, but bruising around her neck and shoulders indicated a violent struggle. She had likely been killed late on the night of February 23rd. Michelle was arrested at the hospital as soon as she was declared stable. She was charged with murder and remanded into custody. In her initial interviews, she denied killing her daughter. She claimed she had blacked out, that she didn't remember anything. She said she had been under immense stress. Detectives discovered that Michelle had been struggling with mental health issues. Records showed previous suicide attempts and a history of depression. But that didn't explain the lengths she had gone to after the murder. The washed dishes, the made bed, the attempt to bury Farah's body in the garden, the suicide attempt. Prosecutors argued that this was not a sudden act of madness, but a deliberate killing. In the weeks that followed, more details emerged. Michelle had been in a custody dispute with Mohammed. Social services were involved. There had been complaints from both sides, accusations of neglect, arguments over visitation. Farah had occasionally been caught in the middle, but none of that justified what had happened. The community in Tavel responded with grief and disbelief. A memorial was set up outside the flat. Children brought flowers. Parents held their kids closer. The story made national headlines. A mother who had killed her own child buried her in the garden and nearly succeeded in taking her own life. The trial would begin later that year. Michelle would plead not guilty. But the facts were clear. Farah Khan was dead, strangled by the one person who was supposed to protect her. And now, the justice system would have to determine what led to such a horrifying act. In the days following the discovery of Farah Khan's body, Kent police began assembling a detailed profile of Michelle Riaz's mental state, personal history, and the events leading up to the murder. Officers retrieved phone records, school attendance logs, and began interviewing social workers, health professionals, and those who had interacted with her in the months prior. What emerged was a portrait of a woman under mounting psychological stress yet still functioning with enough clarity to conceal a crime. Michelle had been under the supervision of mental health services since the previous year. Records from the Kent and Medway NHS Trust revealed that she had attended several outpatient appointments for depression and anxiety. She had also been prescribed antidepressants, though it remained unclear if she had been taking them regularly. In interviews with her primary care physician, detectives learned that Michelle had reported difficulties managing everyday tasks and described feelings of isolation. Yet none of the professionals involved had flagged her as a risk to others, only to herself. Child Protection Services, too, had been involved. Social workers had visited the flat on Hadlow Road on multiple occasions between late 1998 and early 1999. The visits were part of a wider assessment prompted by concerns raised during the custody hearings. Farah had been described as well-dressed and articulate during those visits. There were no reported signs of physical abuse. But the home environment was sometimes described as tense, and Michelle's emotional state was noted as fragile. Still, no safeguarding order had been issued. Meanwhile, Mohammed Khan cooperated fully with police inquiries. He provided access to court documents, letters, and transcripts from the custody proceedings. His legal battle with Michelle had been ongoing for over a year. He had sought joint custody after alleging that Michelle was refusing to allow regular contact with Farah. The case had been contentious, with both parties leveling accusations against each other. But the court had ultimately granted a shared arrangement, allowing Farah to spend time with both parents. The last hearing had taken place in January 1999, just weeks before Farah's death. During that session, the judge had expressed concern over the communication breakdown between the parents but saw no immediate risk to the child. Michelle had left the courtroom visibly upset, according to court officials, but had complied with the visitation schedule in the weeks that followed. Detectives also reviewed Michelle's financial records. Bank statements indicated that she was behind on rent and utility payments. She had been living on benefits and had no recent employment history. Friends told police that she rarely left the flat and had grown increasingly withdrawn. One neighbor described hearing loud arguments between Michelle and a man in the weeks before the murder, though the man's identity was never confirmed. Another neighbor said Michelle had once mentioned feeling like a failure and that she was worried Farah would be taken away. In the interview room at the police station, Michelle remained inconsistent in her story. When asked about the events of February 23rd, she paused for long stretches, sometimes staring at the wall. She claimed that she and Farah had eaten dinner together, watched television, and then gone to bed. She could not or would not explain what had happened after that. When pressed, she said only, "I didn't mean for anything to happen." Forensic officers completed their analysis of the flat. No foreign DNA was found. The sheets used to wrap Farah's body matched those from the upstairs bedroom. Soil from the grave site in the garden was consistent with samples found on Michelle's clothing. The timeline suggested that the burial had taken place during the early hours of February 24th, just before sunrise. A single plastic toy, a small yellow giraffe, was found half buried near the makeshift grave. It had belonged to Farah and was consistent with toys seen in earlier photographs from the flat. Forensic pathologists concluded that Farah had been dead for several hours before being placed in the ground. There were no signs of post-mortem movement or repositioning. Psychiatrists were brought in to evaluate Michelle's mental state. Dr. Philip Joseph, a consultant psychiatrist, conducted a formal assessment. His report concluded that Michelle was suffering from a depressive illness at the time of the killing. However, he stated that she was not psychotic and that she retained the capacity to understand her actions. He noted that Michelle had expressed deep regret but had not shown signs of delusional thinking or hallucinations. In his expert opinion, she met the legal threshold for fitness to plead. At her first court appearance on March 5th, Michelle appeared pale and disoriented. She did not speak during the proceedings. Her solicitor entered a plea of not guilty to the charge of murder. The magistrate ordered her to be held in custody pending trial. Outside the courthouse, members of the public gathered in silence. Some held signs bearing Farah's name. Others simply stood, watching, as the van carrying Michelle drove away. As the case moved toward trial, the Crown Prosecution Service prepared its evidence. Prosecutor Richard Whittam QC led the case, supported by a team of junior counsels. They would argue that Michelle had committed a deliberate and premeditated act, carried out in anger or despair, and that her subsequent actions cleaning the flat, concealing the body, attempting suicide showed consciousness of guilt. The defense, led by Barrister Peter Ginsburg, was expected to raise Michelle's mental health as a mitigating factor. They planned to argue that the killing had not been planned, but had occurred during a moment of psychological collapse. They also intended to challenge the prosecution's timeline, suggesting that Michelle had acted in a dissociative state and had no memory of the event. In the months leading up to trial, Farah's extended family held a private funeral. The service was attended by relatives, close friends, and members of the local Muslim community. Farah was buried according to Islamic rites in a cemetery in Kent. Her father gave a short eulogy. He spoke of her love for school, her laughter, and her gentle nature. At one point, he addressed his daughter directly. "You didn't deserve this. You were everything to me." The trial was scheduled to begin in November 1999 at Maidstone Crown Court. Jury selection was carried out with careful attention to impartiality, given the extensive media coverage. A total of 12 jurors, 6 men and 6 women, were sworn in. The judge, Mr. Justice Poole, reminded them of their duty to remain objective. On the first day of trial, the prosecution laid out its case. Richard Whittam spoke plainly. "This is a case," he said, "where a mother, for reasons that may never be fully understood, took the life of her own daughter. She then buried her in the garden and attempted to end her own life. We will show you that this was not an accident. It was not an act committed in sleep or in madness. It was a choice." Michelle sat silently as the prosecution called its first witnesses. One after another, police officers, forensic experts, and medical staff gave their accounts. The The jury listened as photographs of the crime scene were presented. Some jurors turned away when images of the burial site were shown. In the gallery, Muhammad Khan sat with folded hands, his eyes fixed on the floor. The trial would last nearly 2 weeks. Over that time, Michelle would take the stand. Psychiatric testimony would be challenged. And a jury, faced with the complexity of mental illness, grief, and rage, would have to decide whether what happened in that small flat on Hadlow Road was murder or something else entirely. On the 6th day of trial at Maidstone Crown Court, the atmosphere inside the courtroom was solemn. The prosecution had concluded presenting its forensic evidence, and now the case turned toward the defense. Michelle Reyes, wearing a plain dark cardigan and trousers, was called to the witness stand. The courtroom fell silent as she rose. Her barrister, Peter Ginsburg, began by establishing her history. Michelle confirmed she had been born and raised in Kent and had met Muhammad Khan during her early 20s. They had married in 1993. Farah, their only child, was born 2 years later. Michelle acknowledged that the marriage had become strained by the time Farah was 2 and that the relationship ended formally in 1997. Ginsburg asked her gently about the months leading up to February of the following year. Michelle described her mental state as unstable and said she had felt overwhelmed by the demands of parenting alone. She said she had no family nearby and admitted she had not sought help as often as she should have. When asked directly about the night of February 23rd, she hesitated. "I don't remember everything," she said quietly. Pressed further, Michelle said she recalled putting Farah to bed and feeling what she called a rising panic. She described walking through the flat for hours, unable to sleep, eventually taking tablets. When asked whether she remembered harming Farah, Michelle paused for several seconds before answering, "No. I don't remember doing anything to her. I woke up and she was gone." During cross-examination, prosecutor Richard Whittam QC challenged her account. He asked why, if she had no memory of the killing, she had wrapped Farah's body and buried her in the garden. Michelle did not offer a clear explanation. "I must have done it," she said, "but I don't know why." Whittam pointed out that her actions after Farah's death, cleaning, concealing, and attempting suicide, suggested awareness of guilt. Michelle responded without emotion, "I was in a different place. I didn't want to live anymore." The court heard next from Dr. Philip Joseph, the consultant forensic psychiatrist who had assessed Michelle. His testimony was central to the defense. Dr. Joseph stated that Michelle had been suffering from a major depressive disorder at the time of the offense. He described a collapse in psychological functioning, exacerbated by social isolation, financial hardship, and the strain of the custody battle. He told the court that, in his opinion, Michelle had not acted out of malice or planning. Rather, he believed she had experienced what he termed a dissociative depressive episode, during which her sense of reality had become fragmented. He did not, however, claim that she met the threshold for diminished responsibility under the law. She was depressed, he said, but she was not legally insane. In response, the prosecution called their own psychiatric expert, Dr. James Appleyard. Dr. Appleyard had reviewed Michelle's records and conducted independent assessments. He agreed that Michelle had been depressed but disagreed with the suggestion that her mental state had impaired her ability to understand her actions. She made choices, he told the court. Her depression does not absolve her of responsibility. By the end of the second week, both sides had presented their full cases. The judge, Mr. Justice Poole, addressed the jury with carefully chosen words. He reminded them that sympathy could not cloud judgment, and that they had to consider the evidence dispassionately. He instructed them to determine 2 things: whether Michelle Reyes had caused Farah's death, and whether she had done so with intent to kill or cause serious harm. The jury retired for deliberations on the 12th day of trial. They remained out for just over 8 hours. When they returned, the courtroom filled with the sound of shifting seats and held breath. Michelle stood as the foreman delivered the verdict, guilty of murder. There was no reaction from her. She remained still, her hands clasped in front of her. Justice Poole sentenced her to life imprisonment, with a minimum tariff of 18 years before eligibility for parole. He described the crime as profoundly disturbing, and said that while her mental health had been taken into account, It did not diminish the enormity of her actions. Outside the court, Muhammad Khan addressed the press briefly. His voice was quiet. "My daughter was everything," he said. "No sentence can bring her back, but I hope this brings some peace." The case left a deep mark on the community. In the months that followed, local authorities conducted an internal review into their handling of Michelle's mental health care. The Kent and Medway NHS Trust issued a report stating that while Michelle had been known to services, there had been no indicators that she posed a risk to her child. The review acknowledged that her depression had been documented but not escalated for more intensive intervention. Social services also came under scrutiny. A separate report concluded that while the custody dispute had added strain to Michelle's situation, there had been no legal grounds to remove Farah from her care. The visits by child protection officers had shown no signs of immediate danger. Farah's school, where she had only just begun attending reception class, held a memorial assembly in her honor. Her classmates, too young to fully understand what had happened, were guided through the grief with the help of counselors. A bench was installed in the school garden, engraved with her name and a quote chosen by her father, "In every child's smile, you will find her." Michelle Reyes began her sentence at HMP Holloway before being transferred to a secure mental health unit. She did not appeal her conviction. According to prison records released years later through a Freedom of Information request, she continued to receive psychiatric care while in custody. Reports from within the facility described her as quiet, compliant, and largely isolated from other inmates. In the years that followed, Muhammad Khan withdrew from public life. He moved to another county and declined further interviews. A former colleague later told a local paper that Muhammad had never been the same, and that he still visited Farah's grave regularly. The gravestone, in a quiet section of a Kent cemetery, is modest and simple. A small photograph of Farah is embedded in the stone. The murder of Farah Khan remains one of the most haunting child homicide cases in Kent's history, not for its complexity, but for its intimacy. A moment of violence between four walls in a home where one child should have been safe, where silence afterward carried louder than any scream. The case is often cited in academic studies of maternal filicide, particularly those involving depressive disorders. It has also been used in training programs for social workers to underscore the importance of contextual mental health evaluations even when overt signs of danger are not present. But beyond the reports, the court records, and the headlines, the loss is personal. A 5-year-old girl with a gentle smile, lost not to strangers, but to the one person meant to protect her above all else. There are no more appeals, no lingering legal questions. Only the quiet weight of what was taken, and the silence that followed. Story 4. The Murder of Kaylee Anthony. On July 15, 2008, a call came into the Orange County Sheriff's Office in Florida. George Anthony, a former police officer, told the dispatcher that his 2-year-old granddaughter, Kaylee Marie Anthony, had been missing for 31 days. He explained that his daughter, Casey Anthony, had just admitted that Kaylee was gone. That call marked the beginning of what would become one of the most closely followed and controversial criminal cases in recent American history. George and his wife Cindy Anthony lived in a modest home in Orlando where their daughter Casey and granddaughter Kaylee had also been living. For weeks, George and Cindy had been asking Casey where Kaylee was. Each time, Casey gave them a different story. She claimed that Kaylee was with a nanny named Zenaida Fernandez Gonzalez. Other times, she said they were at the beach or out of town. But the stories never added up. On the day of the call, Cindy Anthony had finally had enough. According to the 911 recording, she told the dispatcher that Casey's car had smelled like a dead body had been inside. That line stood out. It was the first moment investigators realized this might be more than a simple missing child case. Deputies arrived at the Anthony home that same evening. They spoke to Casey, who calmly told them that Kaylee had been kidnapped by her nanny, Zenaida Fernandez Gonzalez, nearly a month earlier. She claimed she had been conducting her own investigation into Kaylee's disappearance and hadn't told law enforcement because she was trying to protect her daughter. From the start, her story raised red flags. Casey led investigators to an apartment complex in Orlando where she said Zenaida had lived. But the unit was vacant. Detectives also discovered that no one by that full name had ever lived there. Later, they tracked down a woman named Zenaida Gonzalez who had visited the complex once but had no connection to Casey or Kaylee. She also had no criminal record and no history with child care. As detectives pressed further, they found more inconsistencies. Casey had said she worked at Universal Studios, but when officers accompanied her to the park, she walked them through the halls pretending to head toward her office until she stopped, turned around, and admitted she didn't actually work there. In fact, she'd been let go years earlier. The deception was undeniable. Casey was arrested on July 16th, one day after Kaylee was reported missing. She was charged with child neglect, giving false statements, and obstruction. When questioned, she stuck to her story about the nanny. She didn't waver, even as evidence against her began to mount. The car that Cindy had referenced in her 911 call, a white Pontiac Sunfire, was impounded and examined. The vehicle had been towed from an Amscot parking lot on June 30th after being abandoned there for days. When George Anthony retrieved the car, he noted a foul odor coming from the trunk. Investigators later confirmed that the smell was consistent with human decomposition. A forensic examination of the trunk revealed several pieces of evidence. There was a stained area on the trunk liner, and an air sample taken from the trunk was sent to a laboratory for analysis. Scientists found high levels of chloroform and chemicals associated with decomposition. Additionally, a single strand of hair microscopically similar to Kaylee's was also recovered from the trunk. The public, meanwhile, was captivated and horrified by the case. News outlets across the country began to cover the investigation daily. Protesters gathered outside the Anthony home demanding answers. Many questioned why a mother would wait 31 days to report a missing child if that child had truly been missing at all. As the weeks went on, the search for Kaylee intensified. Law enforcement combed wooded areas, retention ponds, and abandoned buildings. Texas EquuSearch, a volunteer search and recovery group, joined the effort. Hundreds of people from the community volunteered their time, hoping to find any trace of the little girl with brown eyes and a bright smile. Casey was denied bond at her first hearing, but it was later granted. In August, she was released on bail, only to be rearrested shortly after when new charges were filed relating to theft and check fraud. Investigators had learned that during the time Kaylee was missing, Casey had stolen checks from her friend Amy Heisinger and used them to buy clothes, food, and other items. Surveillance footage showed her shopping at Target and other stores, seemingly carefree. Digital evidence painted an even darker picture. A computer in the Anthony home showed searches for chloroform, neck breaking, and how to make chloroform in the weeks leading up to Kaylee's disappearance. The prosecution would later argue that this indicated premeditation. Despite these mounting pieces of evidence, Kaylee's body had still not been found. For months, the case remained in limbo. Without a body, the prosecution faced a significant hurdle. They had circumstantial evidence, but no definitive proof of how Kaylee had died. That changed on December 11, 2008. A meter reader named Roy Kronk had been working in the area near the Anthony home when he spotted what looked like a small skull in a wooded area off Suburban Drive. He contacted the authorities. When investigators arrived, they found skeletal remains scattered across the area. A garbage bag, a laundry bag, and a child's blanket were also recovered. Dental records confirmed what many feared: the remains belonged to Kaylee Marie Anthony. The medical examiner ruled the manner of death as homicide but was unable to determine the exact cause. The remains were too decomposed. However, duct tape was found near the skull, and the prosecution would later argue that it had been used to suffocate the child. On October 14, 2008, before the body was found, Casey Anthony had already been indicted by a grand jury on charges of first-degree murder, aggravated child abuse, aggravated manslaughter of a child, and 4 counts of providing false information to law enforcement. She was arrested and held without bond. After Kaylee's remains were found, the case against her grew stronger. Prosecutors said the timing and location of the remains pointed directly to Casey. The area where Kaylee was found was only a short distance from the Anthony home, less than half a mile. It was a wooded, overgrown lot often used as a dumping ground. Some of the items found with the body matched items from the Anthony household. Casey's defense team, led by Jose Baez, maintained her innocence. They argued that Kaylee had accidentally drowned in the family pool on June 16, 2008, and that George Anthony had helped Casey cover it up in a panic. George denied the allegation under oath. The trial was still months away, but the nation was watching. Everything, the lies, the trunk evidence, the duct tape, the computer searches would eventually be laid out in court. But for now, the focus had shifted. The question was no longer whether Kaylee was missing. It was how she died, and who was responsible. In the early months of 2009, the investigation into Kaylee Anthony's death was no longer about the search for a missing child. It had shifted fully into a criminal prosecution focused on her mother, Casey Anthony. The discovery of Kaylee's remains had changed everything. Now, investigators began to catalog every detail of what had been found in that wooded lot off Suburban Drive and how it connected to the household just a short walk away. The skeletal remains had been scattered by weather and animals, but key pieces remained intact. The skull was found with duct tape still adhered to strands of what had once been Kaylee's hair. A heart-shaped sticker was discovered on a piece of duct tape, though its relevance would later be debated. Nearby, investigators found a laundry bag identical in pattern and design to ones used in the Anthony home. The blanket wrapped around the remains matched a Winnie the Pooh set belonging to Kaylee. The forensic anthropologist who examined the remains, Dr. Jan Garavaglia, noted no signs of trauma to the bones. But she emphasized that the condition of the body made it impossible to determine a specific cause of death. Despite this, she classified the manner of death as homicide, citing the presence of duct tape and the concealment of the body in bags among the determining factors. The prosecution methodically began building a narrative. At the center of it was the belief that Casey Anthony had wanted to free herself from the responsibilities of motherhood. They pointed to her behavior in the weeks following June 16th nights out at clubs, documented photographs of her dancing, participation in a hot body contest, and time spent with her boyfriend, Tony Lazzaro. Detectives had interviewed Tony extensively. He told them that during the entire period Kaylee was supposedly missing, Casey never once seemed distressed. She stayed at his apartment regularly, cooked meals, and watched movies. She never mentioned Kaylee being gone. On June 20th, just 4 days after the last confirmed sighting of Kaylee, Tony recalled Casey getting a tattoo on her back. It read Bella Vita, Italian for beautiful life. Phone records revealed a pattern of activity that raised further questions. On the morning of June 16, Casey had made several calls to her parents and her then-boyfriend. That was the same day George Anthony would later testify he last saw Kaylee. After that day, Casey's calls to her mother drastically decreased. The defense, however, was preparing an entirely different version of events. Jose Baez had been retained as Casey's lead attorney, and from the outset, he challenged the state's framing of Casey as a calculating killer. He argued that Kaylee had died in a tragic accident, drowning in the family pool. He claimed that George Anthony discovered the body and helped dispose of it to cover up the incident. This theory had not been presented during the initial investigation and would become central to the defense strategy during trial. In preparation for trial, the state brought in experts from the Oak Ridge National Laboratory in Tennessee. They had conducted a chemical analysis of the air samples from the trunk of Casey's car. Dr. Arpid Vass testified that the trunk contained compounds consistent with human decomposition, including high levels of chloroform. He also found fatty acids in the trunk liner, byproducts of human tissue breakdown. Though innovative, this approach had never been used in a criminal trial before, and the defense would later challenge both the methodology and its reliability. The computer forensics presented another layer. Investigators had retrieved search history from the Anthony home computer, initially focusing on the Internet Explorer browser. They found searches for terms like chloroform, how to make chloroform, neck-breaking, and household weapons. These were dated to March of 2008. The state argued that these searches indicated premeditation. But years later, analysis would reveal a critical error. The original examination had only included Internet Explorer, overlooking that another browser, Mozilla Firefox, had also been installed. A later review by software expert John Bradley indicated that the single visit to a site about chloroform had been misrepresented in the original report. It was not visited 84 times, as initially claimed, but only once. This discrepancy would become a key point of contention during trial. In April 2009, the Orange County Clerk's Office announced that the state would seek the death penalty against Casey Anthony. The prosecution, led by State Attorney Lawson Lamar, with Jeff Ashton and Linda Drain-Burdick as lead trial attorneys, believed they had sufficient aggravating factors, including the age of the victim and the alleged manner of death, to justify capital punishment. As the legal teams prepared, tensions inside the Anthony family deepened. Cindy and George Anthony made several public appearances, speaking to media outlets and appearing on national news programs. Cindy continued to defend her daughter, insisting that Casey was a good mother and that Kaylee's death must have been an accident or involved someone else. George, however, became more reserved, and his testimony would later diverge significantly from the defense's claims. In August 2009, Casey Anthony entered a written plea of not guilty to all charges. Meanwhile, the state continued to refine its forensic case, bringing in additional experts to review the duct tape found with Kaylee's remains. Dr. Werner Spitz, a renowned pathologist hired by the defense, challenged the state's interpretation. He concluded that the autopsy had been incomplete and criticized the decision not to open the skull. He also questioned the claim that the duct tape had been used as a murder weapon, noting that it could have been placed after death. The case was becoming a battleground of scientific opinions. Every piece of evidence, from the trunk smell to the computer searches, was now subject to competing narratives. The defense focused on undermining the reliability of the forensics, while the prosecution focused on Casey's behavior, her lies, and the circumstantial web they believed pointed to guilt. As the trial date approached, Judge Belvin Perry took over the case after the original judge, Stan Strickland, recused himself. Perry imposed a gag order to prevent attorneys from discussing the case publicly. He also made the decision to sequester the jury due to the overwhelming media coverage, which by then had turned the case into a national obsession. In May of 2011, nearly 3 years after Kaylee's disappearance, jury selection began in Clearwater, Florida, over 100 miles away from Orlando. The court sought a pool of jurors who had not been exposed to the intense media narrative surrounding the case. After screening hundreds of candidates, 12 jurors and 5 alternates were selected. They were transported back to Orlando, where they would remain sequestered for the duration of the trial. The courtroom was set. On one side, a state determined to prove that Casey Anthony had murdered her daughter to continue a carefree lifestyle. On the other, a defense team that would argue she had been a victim of family trauma, and that the death had been a tragic accident, not a crime. The opening statements would be unlike anything the public expected. But before any evidence could be presented, before any witness could be sworn in, the defense would introduce a theory that would leave the courtroom in stunned silence. On May 24, 2011, inside the Orange County Courthouse in Orlando, the trial of Casey Anthony officially began. The prosecution, led by Linda Drain-Burdick, delivered a controlled and methodical opening. She walked the jury through the last known moments of Kaylee's life, June 16, 2008, and the 31 days that followed. 31 days marked by Casey's silence, her lies, and the absence of any attempt to find her daughter. Burdick told the jury that this was not a case about accident or panic. It was a case about a mother who had decided her child was no longer wanted, and who had taken deliberate steps to make that child disappear. Then, in a moment that stunned both the courtroom and those watching across the country, the defense began their opening. Jose Baez stood before the jury and claimed that on the morning of Kaylee's death, she had drowned in the family's above-ground swimming pool. According to Baez, George Anthony had discovered the body and, in fear of legal consequences, told Casey they had to cover it up. Baez further claimed that Casey had spent her life hiding trauma, alleging that George had sexually abused her as a child, accusations George Anthony firmly denied. Baez offered no physical evidence to support this claim, and George was never charged with any crime. The state began its case with forensic testimony. Jennifer Welch from the Orange County Sheriff's Office Crime Scene Unit described how Kaylee's remains had been found. including the positioning of the bones and the items discovered nearby. Crime scene photographs showed the skull with duct tape across the jaw area, which the prosecution argued had been placed there to silence and kill the child. The placement of the tape as well as its adhesive residue became a central point in their theory. Dr. Jan Garavaglia, the chief medical examiner, testified that the duct tape was applied before decomposition, citing the presence of hair stuck to it. She classified the death as a homicide based on the circumstances, a child found in trash bags, wrapped in a blanket, discarded in the woods. Though she could not determine an exact cause of death, she stated that all other explanations like accidental drowning were unsupported by the evidence. There were no pool chemicals found in the body and no signs of attempted resuscitation. The prosecution then called Cindy Anthony. Her testimony was complicated. She admitted to making several internet searches on the family computer, including one for chloroform, which she claimed was part of a search related to chlorophyll concerning her dog's symptoms. However, forensic analysis later showed that Cindy was at work at the time those searches were conducted. Her time card, verified by her employer, showed she had been logged in and working. This undermined her claim and suggested that Casey had likely been responsible for the searches. Further testimony came from crime scene analyst Karen Korsberg-Lowe, who had examined the single hair found in the trunk of Casey's car. She stated that the hair showed signs of post-mortem banding, a dark band at the root that only appears after death. It was consistent with Kaylee's hair. Although mitochondrial DNA testing could not definitively prove it came from Kaylee, it matched her maternal lineage. Dr. Arpid Vass from the Oak Ridge National Laboratory took the stand to explain the chemical compounds found in the air samples from the trunk. He described the presence of over 400 volatile organic compounds, many associated with decomposition. Chloroform levels were found to be shockingly high, according to his analysis. The defense later challenged his methodology, stating that his work had not been peer-reviewed and that the science was not yet universally accepted. The prosecution also called Amy Heisinger, a friend of Casey's, who testified about Casey's activities during July 2008. She confirmed that Casey had never mentioned Kaylee being missing. Instead, Casey had told her that she was staying with the nanny, Zenaida. Amy also testified about the theft of her checks and Casey's use of her money, describing how Casey had shopped and gone out during the time Kaylee was unaccounted for. Tony Lazzaro, Casey's boyfriend at the time, described Casey's behavior in the weeks after June 16th. He said she never once appeared distressed or expressed concern about Kaylee. He also confirmed that Casey had participated in a hot body contest at a nightclub and had gotten a tattoo shortly after Kaylee's disappearance. When asked directly if Casey ever told him her daughter was missing, he responded no. As the prosecution neared the end of its case, it introduced the contents of Casey's personal journals. One entry, written in early June 2008, a few weeks before Kaylee was last seen, read, "This is the happiest I've been in a very long time." The prosecution suggested that Casey had viewed Kaylee as a burden, and that her disappearance had brought Casey a sense of relief. The defense began its case by calling George Anthony. He denied any involvement in Kaylee's death, denied helping dispose of her body, and denied ever abusing Casey. He became emotional under questioning, particularly when asked about his attempted suicide in January 2009. He explained that the guilt and grief over the loss of his granddaughter had overwhelmed him, and that he had never fully recovered from the trauma. Jose Baez continued to push the theory of an accidental drowning, though no forensic evidence supported it. He also suggested that the duct tape had been placed on the remains after decomposition, possibly by someone attempting to hold the bag closed. The defense called Dr. Werner Spitz, who criticized the autopsy and stated that it was incomplete. He suggested that the tape may have been applied after death and decomposition. The defense also questioned the reliability of the forensic evidence. Computer expert John Bradley testified that the original analysis of the computer activity had been flawed. He clarified that the website related to chloroform had only been visited once, not 84 times as earlier claimed. This undercut part of the prosecution's theory about premeditation. Casey Anthony did not testify. On July 3, 2011, closing arguments began. The prosecution laid out their case once more. that Casey had killed Kaylee by using chloroform and suffocating her with duct tape, then placed her body in the trunk of her car before eventually discarding it in the woods. They pointed to the lies, the behavior, and the forensic evidence as a cohesive narrative of guilt. The defense argued that the state had provided no direct evidence of murder, no cause of death, no eyewitness, no confession. They reminded the jury that reasonable doubt must be the standard, and that the evidence could not definitively prove Casey had killed her daughter. On July 5th, the jury returned with a verdict. Not guilty on the charge of first-degree murder. Not guilty on the charges of aggravated child abuse and aggravated manslaughter of a child. Guilty on 4 misdemeanor counts of providing false information to law enforcement. The courtroom was silent. Outside, the public reaction was immediate and furious. Protesters gathered, chanting, holding signs that read, "Justice for Kaylee." Many felt that a child had died and no one was being held responsible. The jurors later explained that while they believed Casey had likely played a role in Kaylee's death, the prosecution had not proven how Kaylee died or that Casey had killed her beyond a reasonable doubt. On July 7th, Casey was sentenced to 4 years in jail, 1 year for each count of lying to police, with credit for time served. She was released 10 days later. Kaylee's Law, a bill that would make it a felony for a parent to fail to report a missing child within 24 hours, was introduced in multiple states in the aftermath of the trial. It was passed in several jurisdictions. Casey Anthony has lived largely out of the public eye since her release. In the years that followed, she has given few interviews and her life remains the subject of speculation and scrutiny. She has never been charged with any additional crimes related to Kaylee's death. The wooded lot where Kaylee was found has since been cleared. Flowers occasionally appear at its edge, placed silently by strangers who never knew her. Her short life, wrapped in silence and mystery, continues to echo in the public's memory. There are cases that leave behind answers. But this one left behind only questions. And a child lost too soon. Story 5. The Ted Bundy Murders. On the evening of February 1st, 1974, in Seattle, Washington, Linda and Healy left her basement bedroom in a shared house near the University of Washington. She was 21, a student, and well known for preparing ski reports for a local radio station. But the next morning, her housemates noticed she hadn't made her usual early broadcast. Her car was still outside. Her door was closed. When they finally entered her bedroom, what they found didn't make sense. Her bed was made oddly neat for someone who always rushed in the mornings. But the pillow had blood on it, and the sheets were missing. On her desk chair was a neatly laid out outfit, a blouse and slacks she had worn the day before. Her wallet and ID were still there. Her bicycle sat unused. The window had been left open. There were no signs of forced entry. But Linda was gone. Seattle police took the case seriously from the beginning, though they didn't have much to go on. There had been no witnesses, no known enemies, no ransom, just a quiet, smart student who had vanished overnight. The media reported it, but there were no leads. Weeks passed and Linda's name faded from headlines. But her disappearance wasn't an isolated event. Less than 2 months later, in nearby Olympia, another young woman went missing. Donna Gail Manson, a 19-year-old student at Evergreen State College, was last seen walking toward a campus concert on March 12th. She never arrived. Again, no witnesses, no physical evidence. By the time April came, police across Washington started to notice a pattern. Young, white women. Long dark hair, parted in the middle. All college students. All vanishing without a sound. On April 17th, Susan Elaine Rancourt disappeared from Central Washington State College in Ellensburg. She had attended a meeting on campus that evening, planning to stop by the laundry room afterward. She never came back. 2 students later reported seeing a man that night, a man with his arm in a sling, asking for help carrying books to his car. Both women recalled feeling uneasy, but only one accepted his request. She helped him, then walked away unharmed. The other didn't. Her name was Susan. She matched the same description as the others. Police now had a description of a possible suspect. A man in his 20s, attractive, well-dressed. He was charming, disarming. That summer, the disappearances intensified. On May 6th, Roberta Kathleen Parks left her dormitory at Oregon State University in Corvallis to meet friends for coffee. She never arrived. Her belongings were untouched. No sign of struggle. The pattern was tightening, but still, investigators had no name. In early June, Brenda Carol Ball, 22, was last seen at the Flame Tavern in Burien. Witnesses said she had spoken with a man that night in the parking lot. He was injured using a sling. She left with him. She was never seen again. By now, fear was spreading through the Pacific Northwest. Women on campuses began walking in groups. Self-defense classes popped up. University officials issued warnings. But the man they were looking for, he seemed to be one step ahead. Every time. On June 11th, Georgian Hawkins disappeared from an alleyway behind the UW sorority houses. That night, she had been walking a familiar path between her boyfriend's fraternity and her own house. She never made it. The next morning, her friends and sorority sisters called police. They found nothing, no blood, no signs of a struggle. Just silence. Witnesses later remembered a man with a cast on his leg who had been asking women for help loading his car. He told them he needed to carry something heavy. That detail stuck. The man wasn't just charming, he was careful. He used props pretext. He created sympathy. Nobody suspected danger from the man with the broken arm. By July, the case had grown too large for any one department. The King County Sheriff's Office, local police departments, and state investigators began sharing information. They created a task force. Notes were compared, sightings logged, names collected. Still, there was no suspect. Then came Lake Sammamish. On July 14, 1974, a warm Sunday, thousands of people gathered at Lake Sammamish State Park outside Seattle. It was a busy summer day. Around midday, witnesses reported seeing a man approach several women asking for help loading his small sailboat onto his car. He introduced himself as Ted. He had his arm in a sling. One woman agreed to help him. She was never seen again. Her name was Janice Ott. She was 23. She had ridden her bike to the lake that day. Hours later, another woman, Denise Naslund, disappeared from the same park. She had gone to use a restroom and never returned. Two women vanished from the same location on the same day, within hours of each other. Dozens of witnesses had seen the man. They described him as handsome, around 6 feet tall, light brown hair. He wore a white tennis outfit and had a sling on his arm. He said his name was Ted. The task force now had a name and a face. The sketch of Ted was released to the media. Tips came flooding in. Among those who called in was Ann Rule, a former police officer and crime writer. She had been working on a book about missing women and recognized the description. She had a friend who fitted Theodore Robert Bundy. But her friend, Ted, he was studying law. He had volunteered at a suicide hotline. He was thoughtful, soft-spoken. Still, she called it in. So did his girlfriend, Elizabeth Klopfer, who had also noticed strange behavior. Missing crutches, a plaster cast he didn't need, odd items in his apartment. But when police followed up, Bundy's name was one of over 1,000 on a long list of suspects. There wasn't enough to arrest him. By the end of the summer, bodies began to surface. On September 6th, 2 skeletal remains were found in Issaquah. They were later identified as Janice Ott and Denise Naslund. Near them were remains of an unidentified third woman. The area was remote, forested. Investigators found hair, bone fragments, and partial clothing. They were the first solid proof of what had happened to the missing women. But it wouldn't be the last discovery. In March of the following year, more remains would be found on Taylor Mountain. For victims, including Linda and Healy, by late 1974, the pattern was clear. A serial killer was operating across the Pacific Northwest. He was methodical, mobile. He blended in. His victims were similar, and he used charm as a weapon. Ted Bundy was still not in custody, but his name was rising higher on the suspect list, and his violence was about to escalate. In August of 1974, nearly a month after the double disappearance at Lake Sammamish, Ted Bundy made his quiet exit from Washington. He told his girlfriend he was moving to Salt Lake City to attend law school at the University of Utah. To friends and acquaintances, it seemed like a natural step. Bundy had always been ambitious, articulate, and outwardly composed. But behind the polished exterior, something far darker had begun to solidify. Not long after arriving in Utah, women began to vanish again. On October 2nd, Nancy Wilcox, a 16-year-old cheerleader from Holiday, Utah, was last seen getting into a car near her home. Witnesses recalled that she had told friends earlier that day she was going out for a short drive. Her body was never recovered, but Bundy would later admit to abducting her. According to his own statements, he had not initially intended to kill her. He said he wanted to keep her for a while, but he claimed he panicked and strangled her when she screamed. He buried her near Capitol Reef National Park, according to his later confessions, but no remains were ever found. 13 days later, on the night of October 15th, Melissa Smith, the 17-year-old daughter of the Midvale police chief, went missing after leaving a pizza parlor. Her bike was found abandoned. Her body was discovered 9 days later in Summit Park. She had been sexually assaulted, beaten, and strangled. Her hair had been washed and her body carefully repositioned. The post-mortem suggested she had been kept alive for several hours, possibly even days. Just weeks after Melissa's murder, 17-year-old Laura M. disappeared on Halloween night after leaving a cafe in Lehigh. Her body was found nearly a month later near a riverbank in American Fork Canyon. She had suffered similar injuries: strangulation, sexual assault. Her remains were partially decomposed, but the parallels to the earlier victims were unmistakable. The Utah police began to fear what their counterparts in Washington already suspected. A serial predator was operating in their midst. But the cases, while disturbingly similar, lacked unifying forensic evidence. There were no fingerprints, no usable DNA, and no eyewitnesses who could clearly identify a suspect. Bundy's ability to blend into his surroundings, his clean-cut appearance, his calm demeanor allowed him to move through communities without raising suspicion. His next known attack took place not in Utah, but in Colorado. On January 12, 1975, 23-year-old registered nurse Karen Campbell vanished from the Wildwood Inn in Snowmass Village, where she had been staying with her fiancé and his children. She was last seen heading to her hotel room to retrieve a magazine. Her body was discovered a month later, frozen in a snowbank a short distance from the inn. She had been bludgeoned and left exposed to the elements. The autopsy revealed a fractured skull, and evidence suggested she had been sexually assaulted. This marked Bundy's first known killing in Colorado, and it suggested a growing confidence. He had crossed state lines, changed tactics, and continued to evade detection. Investigators in Colorado, Utah, and Washington had not yet connected the cases in any formal way, but the similarities were growing harder to ignore. Just over a month later, on March 15th, Bundy struck again. This time in Vail. Julie Cunningham, a 26-year-old ski shop employee, was walking from her apartment to a dinner date with a friend when she encountered a man on crutches. He asked for help carrying his ski boots to his car. She agreed. She never arrived at the restaurant. Bundy later confessed to abducting her, restraining her in his car, and driving her to a remote location outside Rifle, Colorado. There, he claimed he strangled her and buried her body. Like many of his victims, her remains were never recovered. Within weeks, another woman vanished. Denise Oliverson, 24, disappeared on April 6th from Grand Junction, Colorado. Her bicycle was found abandoned under a viaduct. She had been on her way to visit her parents. Bundy later claimed to have thrown her body into the Colorado River, though no trace of her was ever found. His next victim would survive. On November 8, 1974, Carol Duranch, an 18-year-old high school student, was approached in the parking lot of the Fashion Place Mall in Murray, Utah, by a man identifying himself as Officer Roseland. He told her there had been an attempted break-in on her vehicle and that she needed to come with him to file a report. Carol got into his car, a tan Volkswagen Beetle. But something felt wrong. The man's police ID looked fake. He took side roads instead of heading toward the station. When she questioned him, he became agitated. He pulled over near a school, then tried to handcuff her. She fought back. One cuff locked around her wrist, the other dangled loose. She kicked open the passenger door and ran into oncoming traffic. A passing couple stopped and took her to the police. Carol gave a detailed description. She remembered his face, his car, his voice. Police took her seriously. They created a composite sketch. It bore a striking resemblance to the man called Ted seen at Lake Sammamish. Later that same night, in Bountiful, Utah, a few miles north, 17-year-old Deborah Kent disappeared after leaving a high school play to pick up her brother. Witnesses recalled seeing a man walking through the school halls earlier that evening, asking for a teacher who didn't exist. Another student later remembered seeing the same man approach Deborah in the parking lot. That night, police searched the school grounds. There were no signs of struggle. But in the parking lot, they found a key. It matched the handcuffs that had been used on Carol Duranch. The investigation in Utah now had a critical lead. The suspect had used a false name, posed as a police officer, attempted an abduction, and successfully kidnapped another woman later that same day. The tan Volkswagen was now a key piece of evidence. On August 16, 1975, in Granger, Utah, a Utah Highway Patrol officer noticed a tan Beetle cruising slowly through a residential area in the early hours of the morning. The driver, alone, appeared to be scoping the neighborhood. The officer pulled the vehicle over. Inside, he found a ski mask, a crowbar, an ice pick, rope, handcuffs, and garbage bags. Bundy claimed he used the tools for skiing and camping. But the officer wasn't convinced. He arrested him on suspicion of burglary. The contents of the car were impounded. When investigators from the Carol Duranch case examined the items, they found striking similarities to her description. The handcuffs matched, the car matched, and most importantly, the face matched. Carol Duranch was brought in to view a lineup. She identified Bundy without hesitation. He was charged with aggravated kidnapping and attempted criminal assault. While out on bail, he returned to Seattle briefly, staying with friends and trying to maintain a semblance of normalcy. But behind the scenes, he was panicking. He knew the net was closing in. In February of 1976, Bundy stood trial in Salt Lake City. The prosecution presented forensic evidence, eyewitness testimony, and the items found in his car. The defense argued it was circumstantial. The jury didn't agree. He was found guilty and sentenced to 1 to 15 years in Utah State Prison. But even as he sat behind bars, investigators from multiple states were building cases against him. The evidence from Colorado was growing stronger. A search of his apartment in Salt Lake turned up maps, brochures, and photos of locations where victims had vanished. Scrapbooks, clippings, and more importantly, hair samples. What no one knew then, not the guards, not the prosecutors, not the families of the missing, was that Ted Bundy had no intention of staying in prison. He had already begun planning his escape. And in Colorado, the courtroom where he would stand trial for murder would become the stage for one of the most brazen disappearances in criminal history. On June 7, 1977, inside the Pitkin County Courthouse in Aspen, Colorado, Ted Bundy was escorted into the law library on the second floor. He had been granted special permission to prepare his own defense for the upcoming murder trial of Karen Campbell. For weeks, he had been studying case files, pacing in his cell, and requesting legal materials. He wore a blue shirt and no restraints. A deputy was posted outside the door, but for a brief window of time, Bundy was left unsupervised. A window in the library had been left partially open to let in fresh air. Bundy waited until he was alone, then jumped from the second story. He landed in a courtyard and took off on foot, disappearing into the surrounding mountains. The escape triggered a manhunt that lasted 6 days. Local authorities, sheriff's deputies, and search teams combed the rugged terrain, while helicopters scanned the forests from above. Bundy, meanwhile, had stolen camping gear and evaded detection by hiding in an abandoned cabin. At one point, he broke into a trailer, stole food and a rifle, and narrowly avoided a roadblock. But he was exhausted, disoriented, and lost weight rapidly. On June 13th, he was spotted by a patrol car about 8 miles from Aspen. The officer approached him quietly and arrested him without resistance. Bundy was returned to custody and placed in solitary confinement. Despite the escape, Bundy remained calm and composed in public appearances. He continued to file motions in court, requested a change of venue, and maintained his innocence. Yet behind the scenes, he was already planning his next move. 7 months later, on the night of December 30th, 1977, Bundy carried out his second escape. This time, he had spent weeks carving a hole in the ceiling of his jail cell at the Garfield County Jail in Glenwood Springs. He used a hacksaw blade, smuggled in by an unknown party, and dropped weight through self-imposed starvation to fit through the opening. Once inside the crawl space, he maneuvered through the ceiling panels, and when the guards were distracted by the New Year's holiday, Bundy climbed through the ceiling into a jailer's apartment above. He stole civilian clothes and walked out the front door. By the time guards noticed his absence, Bundy was already hundreds of miles away. He boarded a bus to Denver, then caught a flight to Chicago, using stolen identification. From there, he traveled by train to Ann Arbor, Michigan, and eventually made his way south. On January 8, 1978, he arrived in Tallahassee, Florida, under the alias Chris Hagen. He rented a room at the Oak Tree Inn near Florida State University. He had no money, no job, and no support system. But within weeks, he would commit one of the most brutal attacks in his entire series of crimes. In the early hours of January 15th, just after 2:30 in the morning, Bundy entered the Chi Omega sorority house on the FSU campus. The front door had a broken lock. Inside, most of the residents were asleep. He moved quickly, silently. He first entered the room of Margaret Bowman, age 21. She had been asleep in her bed. Bundy bludgeoned her with a piece of firewood he had found outside, then strangled her with a nylon stocking. She never woke. He then entered the room of Lisa Levy, also 20 years old. She too had been asleep. Bundy attacked her with the same piece of wood, then sexually assaulted her. The autopsy would reveal bite marks on her left buttock and breast. Bundy had also strangled her. She died minutes later. Bundy continued down the hall and entered 2 more rooms. In the third room, he attacked Kathy Kleiner, age 20, striking her across the face and jaw with the wood. The noise woke her roommate, Karen Chandler, who was then also struck. The commotion caused a nearby light to switch on, and Bundy fled the house. Both women survived, though they suffered severe injuries. Kathy's jaw was broken in 3 places. Karen had a fractured skull and lost several teeth. Neither could identify their attacker, but both recalled the same thing: a tall man, dark hair, quick, and silent. Just minutes after the Chi Omega attacks, Bundy entered another apartment just down the street. He broke in and attacked Cheryl Thomas, a dance major at FSU, in her sleep. He fractured her jaw and skull, dislocated her shoulder, and left her for dead. But Cheryl survived. Her neighbors, hearing the struggle, called police. When they arrived, they found semen stains, a pantyhose mask, and hair evidence that would later be used in court. Bundy fled Tallahassee the next morning. He stole a car and drove west, passing through Alabama and into Pensacola. Along the way, he continued to steal food, clothing, and gas. He stopped using the Chris Hagen alias and introduced himself to others as Ken Meisner. Despite a nationwide manhunt, Bundy moved with ease. His face had been in newspapers, his name broadcast on national television. But law enforcement agencies had little coordination across state lines, and Bundy took advantage of the gaps. Then, on February 9th, in Lake City, Florida, 12-year-old Kimberly Leach was called to the office at Lake City Junior High School to retrieve a forgotten purse. She never returned to class. Her body was found 7 weeks later in a pig shed near Suwannee River State Park. She had been raped and murdered. Bundy would later confess to abducting her from outside the school, forcing her into his stolen van, and assaulting her before killing her. It would be his final known murder. On February 12, 1978, just 3 days after Kimberly's disappearance, Bundy was discovered driving a stolen orange Volkswagen Beetle in Pensacola. Officer David Lee of the Pensacola Police Department pulled him over. Bundy attempted to flee on foot and struggled during the arrest, but Lee subdued him and placed him in custody. At first, Bundy refused to give his name. He claimed to be a man from Atlanta, but in his pockets were stolen credit cards, multiple IDs, and receipts linking him to Tallahassee. Fingerprints confirmed his true identity. The man once on trial for murder in Colorado was now facing a death penalty case in Florida. Bundy was charged with the murders of Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy and the attempted murders of Kathy Kleiner, Karen Chandler, and Cheryl Thomas. The Chi Omega case would be the first to go to trial. The courtroom was packed. Cameras lined the walls. Bundy, acting as part of his own defense team, cross-examined witnesses and challenged forensic evidence. But the prosecution had compelling proof. Bite mark analysis confirmed the impressions on Lisa Levy's body matched Bundy's teeth. Hair samples found in the sorority house matched his DNA. Eyewitnesses placed him near the scene. On July 24, 1979, the jury deliberated for less than 7 hours. Bundy was found guilty on all counts. The next day, he was sentenced to death. In January 1980, he stood trial again, this time for the murder of Kimberly Leach. The evidence included fibers from the van, eyewitnesses who saw him with the child, and items of her clothing found in his possession. He was convicted and handed a second death sentence. He was sent to Florida State Prison in Rayford, and for nearly a decade, Bundy would remain there, filing appeals, granting interviews, and slowly unraveling the full scope of his crimes. In his final years, Bundy began to confess, first in fragments, then in detail. He admitted to at least 30 murders across 7 states, though investigators believe the true number may be higher. He described the abductions, the methods, the burial sites. Some of his victims were never found. Others were only identified decades later. He remained manipulative until the end, offering confessions in exchange for delays to his execution. But it wasn't enough. On January 24, 1989, at 7:16 in the morning, Ted Bundy was executed in the electric chair. Outside the prison, over 200 people gathered. Some held signs. Others passed out T-shirts that read, "Burn Bundy, burn." When the lights flickered, the crowd cheered. Inside the walls of Rayford, there was no celebration, just silence. For the families left behind, there was no closure, only the memory of names that had once filled classrooms, ski lodges, and dormitory beds. Names that now exist only in files, photographs, and the recollections of those who survived the years of fear. Ted Bundy left behind no legacy of twisted genius, no mystery worth admiring. Only a trail of devastation and the chilling reminder that evil can sometimes wear the face of charm. And you and I, we may never truly understand the depth of what he concealed behind that smile. But the echoes of his crimes still remain in the forests, in the courtrooms, and in the eyes of those who remember what he took. Story 6. The Chris Watts Murders. At 1:40 a.m. on August 13, 2018, a doorbell camera picked up footage of Sean Ann Watts returning home to her house on Saratoga Trail in Frederick, Colorado. She had just come back from a business trip in Arizona. Her friend and colleague, Nicola Toft, had dropped her off after the flight. Sean Ann, 34 years old and 15 weeks pregnant, was expected to have a doctor's appointment that same morning. She never showed up. By 12:10 p.m., Nicole grew concerned. She hadn't heard from Sean Ann all morning. No messages, no phone calls, nothing. What added to the concern was that Sean Ann had a history of lupus and other health complications. It wasn't like her to ignore calls or miss appointments. Nicole drove back to the Watts home and rang the doorbell. No one answered. She called Chris Watts, Sean Ann's husband, and asked him if he knew where Sean Ann was. Chris said he didn't know. Nicole then called the police. At 1:40 p.m., Officer Scott Coonrod from the Frederick Police Department arrived at the Watts residence. Nicole was already there. Chris showed up shortly after, saying he had left work early to come home. He let the officer inside. The house was quiet. Sean Ann's purse was still there. Her phone was on a couch cushion. Her keys were on the counter. The car was still in the garage, with both girls' car seats still strapped in. Bella and Celeste, 4 and 3 years old, were nowhere to be found. Chris told Officer Coonrod that he and Sean Ann had had an emotional conversation early that morning, around 5 a.m., before he left for work. He said she had told him she was going to take the kids to a friend's house. When asked why she would leave her phone, purse, and car behind, he said he wasn't sure. Later that day, the Frederick Police Department officially listed Sean Ann, Bella, and Celeste as missing persons. The Colorado Bureau of Investigation and the FBI were brought in. A statewide alert was issued. Chris gave interviews to local news stations pleading for their safe return. In one interview with Denver 7, he stood on his porch, arms folded across his chest, and said, "I just want them back. I just want them to come back." By August 14th, less than 24 hours later, investigators were already growing suspicious of Chris. His behavior didn't match the profile of a man desperate to find his missing wife and children. He seemed flat, unemotional. He wasn't asking many questions. He wasn't actively searching. And then there were the inconsistencies. Investigators asked him to take a polygraph test. He agreed. Tammy Lee, an FBI agent, administered the test on August 15th. Before starting, she told him, "You should not take this if you're not being completely honest." Chris said he understood. He failed the test. When she told him the results, she added, "It's clear you're not telling the truth." That same day, Chris asked to speak with his father, Ronnie Watts. The conversation was recorded. In the interview room, Chris leaned in and whispered, "I'll tell you what happened." He said Sean and had killed the girls after he told her he wanted a separation. And then, in a rage, he killed her. It was a story that didn't add up. Investigators knew this. The next day, on August 16th, Chris changed his story again. This time, he admitted to killing Sean, and he said they had gotten into an argument after he told her about the affair he was having with a coworker. Her name was Nicole Kessinger. According to Chris, Sean had gotten upset. He claimed she had threatened to take the kids away. He said he snapped. He then admitted to smothering Sean to death in their bedroom. After she was dead, he wrapped her in a sheet, put her in the back of his truck, and drove to a remote oil site owned by Anadarko Petroleum, his employer at the time. He took Bella and Celeste with him alive. Once there, he said he smothered both girls and stuffed their bodies into separate oil tanks. He buried Sean in a shallow grave nearby. At first, Chris refused to say exactly what he did to the girls, but the evidence was piling up. Surveillance video from a neighbor's camera showed him backing his truck into the garage in the early hours of August 13th. He had claimed he had left for work around 5:15 a.m., but the video showed that he had loaded something large into the back of the truck before leaving. Investigators believed that was when he transported the bodies. Nicole Kessinger, the woman Chris was having an affair with, told investigators that Chris had told her he was in the process of separating from Sean, but he never mentioned she was pregnant. She said that Chris had told her the divorce was almost final. She also said that he had seemed cold and distant in the days leading up to August 13th, and that on the morning Sean disappeared, he had texted her that his family was gone. On August 16th, the same day Chris confessed, investigators went to the oil site. They found Shanann's body buried in a shallow grave. Nearby were two large oil tanks. They opened them and found the bodies of Bella and Celeste submerged inside. The autopsy reports would later confirm the cause of death for all three. Sean had been strangled. Bella and Celeste had been smothered. Forensic evidence showed that Bella had fought back. She had bite marks on her tongue and defensive injuries. Celeste's injuries were consistent with smothering. Both girls had been shoved through an 8-inch hatch at the top of the oil tanks. Chris was arrested and charged with 5 counts of first-degree murder. 2 additional counts were added under Colorado's statute for killing children under the age of 12. He was also charged with unlawful termination of a pregnancy and 3 counts of tampering with a deceased human body. In the days following the arrest, the public reaction was one of horror. Sean had often posted on social media about her happy family life. Her videos showed Chris playing with the kids, kissing her belly, smiling at birthday parties. The image of a perfect family shattered overnight. The prosecution team began preparing for trial, but they wouldn't need it. On November 6, 2018, Chris pleaded guilty to all charges in exchange for taking the death penalty off the table. Shanann's family supported the deal. They didn't want to prolong the pain. On November 19th, Chris was sentenced to 5 life sentences without the possibility of parole. He was transferred to the Dodge Correctional Institution in Wisconsin for his own safety. During sentencing, Judge Marcelo Kopkow stated, "This is the most inhumane and vicious crime that I have handled out of the thousands of cases that I've seen. What haunted people most wasn't just the brutality of the murders. It was the calmness with which Chris had lied. The interviews, the press statements. The way he had stood on his porch and asked for his family to come home when he already knew where they were. Inside the small, windowless room at the Frederick Police Department, the overhead lights buzzed faintly as Chris sat across from his father. The room was quiet, except for the soft hum of the recording equipment. Ronnie leaned in, his face pale. Chris had asked to speak to him alone, without the agents present. When they stepped out, Chris began to cry. For the first time, his voice broke. "I freaked out," he said softly. "I didn't know what to do." Ronnie looked confused. He asked what happened to Sean and Chris hesitated. Then he said she had hurt the girls, that he had seen it happen, that he reacted. It was the first version of his story, and it wouldn't hold for long. When the agents returned, they pressed him. He repeated the story, that Sean had harmed the children after an argument, and he had killed her in response. But the investigators had already reviewed his phone data, analyzed the surveillance footage, and interviewed witnesses. Nothing supported his claim. The evidence was pointing in one direction: a deliberate, premeditated act. Inside his phone, investigators found deleted text messages between Chris and his coworker, Nicole Kessinger. Through forensic recovery, they uncovered a pattern of obsessive communication. In the days leading up to the murders, Chris had been looking at secluded vacation spots and researching how to prepare for a new life. He had been sending pictures of himself, shirtless, to Nicole. He had been watching videos about starting over. But nowhere in his search history was there any indication that he planned to take his family with him. Nicole had been cooperative from the moment she was contacted on August 15th. During her interviews with the Weld County District Attorney's Office, she provided detailed accounts of their relationship. She said they had met in June, and by early July, their connection had turned romantic. Chris had told her he was separated. She said she had no idea Shanann was pregnant. She also said that when she pressed him about his plans, he always implied that his divorce was nearly finalized. She said he had never mentioned any conflict. Investigators obtained Chris's work records from Anadarko Petroleum. On August 13th, he had received a call at 5:27 a.m. from a coworker named Cody Roberts. Cody said Chris had asked specifically to go to the Service 319 oil site that morning, which was not his usual assignment. He had claimed there was a leak and that he needed to check it out early. Cody had agreed, but found it strange Chris had never volunteered for that site before. The Service 319 site was nearly 40 miles from Frederick, remote with few visitors. When law enforcement arrived there on August 16th, they found disturbed earth near a patch of weeds. Cadaver dogs alerted immediately. A drone was flown overhead to document the area. Shanann's grave was shallow, only around 18 inches deep. Her body had been wrapped in a sheet from her bed. There were no personal items buried with her. No clothing besides her underwear and bra. Her face was bruised and one of her fingernails was broken. The oil tanks stood about 100 feet from the grave. Each tank had a small hatch at the top, no wider than 8 inches. Investigators had to use industrial equipment to extract the contents. Inside, they found the remains of Bella and Celeste. Their clothing had partially dissolved in the crude oil. Their autopsy reports later confirmed that both girls were alive when they arrived at the site. Bella had defensive wounds inside her mouth. Oil had entered their airways post-mortem. Investigators also reviewed Chris's text messages in the 48 hours before the murders. On August 11th, he had texted Nicole that he had a clear mind now and that he was free to breathe. On August 12th, the day before the murders, he took Shanann out to dinner at the Lazy Dog Sports Bar in Erie, Colorado. The receipt showed he ordered a salmon dish and a beer. He told Shanann he wanted to talk, that he wasn't happy, that he didn't think their marriage could be saved. Shanann had texted a friend that night, saying she felt like something was very wrong. She wrote that Chris hadn't touched her in weeks and that he didn't even kiss me goodbye. After Shanann went to bed that night, Chris made a series of Google searches. One was for how to prepare for a separation. Another was for the lyrics to Metallica's Battery. The next morning, he made breakfast for the girls, eggs and cold cereal. He later told investigators that they were still wearing their pajamas when he picked them up and put them in the truck. At the sentencing hearing in Greeley on November 19th, Shanann's family sat in the front row. Her father, Frank Rzusek, delivered a statement through tears. He said he had trusted Chris, that he had loved him like a son, that he could never comprehend how someone who had once looked him in the eye could do what he did. Shanann's mother, Sandra, said her daughter had been a devoted mother, that Bella and Celeste had been her entire world. The court also heard from Weld County District Attorney Michael Rourke. He said the evidence showed that Chris had deliberately planned the murders, that he had waited until Sean and returned from her trip, knowing it would be his last chance, that he had killed her in their bed, then taken the children still alive on a 40-minute drive to their deaths. Rourke said that Bella had watched her sister die and had begged for her own life. The autopsy revealed bruising on Bella's arms and cuts on the inside of her lips. Her final moments were marked by terror. Celeste's body showed similar signs, but her cause of death was listed purely as asphyxia due to smothering. Both girls had crude oil in their stomachs, suggesting they inhaled it as their bodies were submerged. During the autopsy, Shanann's body showed signs of strangulation. There was bruising on her neck and a fracture to the hyoid bone. The medical examiner concluded that death would not have been instantaneous. It would have taken minutes. There were no drugs or alcohol in her system. Her unborn son, Nico, had died due to her death. The pregnancy was intact. After sentencing, Chris was transferred out of Colorado. The Colorado Department of Corrections determined that his safety could not be guaranteed in a state facility. He was moved to the Dodge Correctional Institution in Waupun, Wisconsin, under an interstate compact agreement. In prison, Chris was placed in protective custody. He was not allowed contact with other inmates. In February of the following year, he gave a 5-hour interview to investigators from the FBI and the Colorado Bureau of Investigation. During that conversation, he admitted that his previous stories had all been lies. He said that he killed Sean, and after she confronted him about the affair, he said she cried and that he straddled her on the bed. He said she never screamed. As he strangled her, he said she didn't fight back. He told investigators that Bella had walked into the room afterward and asked, "What's wrong with Mommy?" He admitted that both girls were alive when he put them into the back seat of his truck. He said Celeste fell asleep on the ride. Bella stayed awake. He drove them to the oil site in silence. Once there, he smothered Celeste with a blanket in the back seat while Bella sat next to her. Then he turned to Bella. She asked him, "Is the same thing going to happen to me as Cece?" He told investigators he didn't answer. He just did it. His confession was devoid of emotion. Investigators later described it as one of the most disturbing interviews they had ever conducted. Chris said he felt no rage, no sudden snap. He said he was thinking only of how to leave his life behind, how to be with Nicole. He said that once he had made the decision, everything else felt like a dream. Nicole Kessinger changed her name and relocated. She has spoken only once since the case closed, telling investigators that she would never have continued the relationship had she known the truth. She said she felt betrayed, horrified, and used. The house on Saratoga Trail remained empty for months. A foreclosure sale was scheduled but delayed repeatedly due to legal complications. Neighbors said that every time they looked at the house, they remembered the porch interview. The silence inside, the way nothing had seemed out of place and yet everything was. In the weeks following Chris Watts' sentencing, law enforcement agencies continued combing through the details of the case despite his guilty plea. Investigators at the Colorado Bureau of Investigation and FBI knew that while the core facts had been established, there were still unanswered questions. Chris's shifting stories had left gaps. What precisely led to the murders, and when had he decided to act? More importantly, had there been signs missed along the way? On February 18, 2019, agents from the FBI and CBI traveled to Wisconsin to conduct a post-conviction interview with Chris at Dodge Correctional Institution. The meeting was recorded and later released in full. It lasted over 5 hours. This time, Chris agreed to speak without a lawyer present. He said he wanted to come clean about everything. Sitting in the sterile interview room, Chris leaned forward, hands folded. His voice was low but steady. Agents asked him to start from the beginning, not the morning of the murders, but the weeks leading up to them. He admitted that by early July he had emotionally detached from Shanann. He said he began distancing himself physically and mentally. He grew resentful, he claimed, but offered no real explanation for why. He described feeling trapped. When he met Nicole Kessinger, he said their connection was instant. The relationship gave him a sense of escape. He began imagining a different future. He told the agents that he believed Shanann suspected something, but that he never admitted to the affair until the night before the murders. He claimed they had had several arguments during the Arizona trip she had taken with friends and Thrive colleagues, and that she had sensed his coldness the moment she returned. Chris then recalled the final conversation they had early on the morning of August 13th. He said Shanann had initiated sex, and afterward she asked if he had been seeing someone else. He admitted that he had. He said she broke down crying. She told him he would never see the kids again. Chris claimed her words triggered something in him. He said he couldn't bear the thought of losing his children, but then admitted that he had already made the decision to kill Shanann before she even came home from her trip. The agents asked him when that decision had crystallized. He paused, then said it had happened sometime during the weekend while Shanann was still away. He said he felt like something inside me just shut off. He described lying in bed, thinking about his life with Nicole, and realizing that Shanann and the kids were in the way. He didn't say it with anger. He said it like a man describing an errand. When asked why he didn't just get a divorce, Chris said he didn't feel like he could. He said he feared what a custody battle would look like, that he didn't want to split time with the girls. One of the agents asked him if there had ever been a moment when he changed his mind. He said no. Chris then detailed the murders again, this time without contradiction. He admitted that he strangled Shanann while she was lying in bed. He said she never screamed. He claimed to have felt nothing. Afterward, he wrapped her in a sheet and dragged her down the stairs. He said he loaded her body into the truck while Bella and Celeste were awake, walking around the house. He said Bella asked, "What's wrong with Mommy?" He told her Shanann wasn't feeling well. He confirmed that he drove them out to the Survey Oil site with Shanann's body in the back and both girls sitting unrestrained in the back seat. He said they dozed off during the drive. Once at the site, he removed Shanann's body first and laid it on the ground near the gravesite he had dug the day before. He said Bella and Celeste asked again what was going on. He didn't answer. Chris then described how he smothered Celeste with a blanket while she sat in the back seat. Bella watched. When he came back for her, she asked him, "What happened to Cece?" He said he didn't respond. As he smothered her, she struggled. He said her last words were, "Daddy, no." He then carried both girls up the stairs of the oil tanks, one at a time, and dropped their bodies through the small hatches. He said he could hear the splash. The agents asked him why he didn't just leave, why he didn't walk away from his marriage like so many others do. Chris said he didn't know. He said he felt consumed by a single thought that ending their lives would be a clean break. He described it as erasing everything. Further investigation into his search history revealed that in the days leading up to the murders, Chris had searched for topics like, how does it feel when someone drowns? And when to say I love you in a new relationship. Analysts found that he had also used a calculator app on his phone to store images and messages from Nicole, hidden behind a numeric code. He had been planning a vacation with her to Aspen. He had told her he loved her. Nicole, in her final interview with investigators, said that she had begun distancing herself from Chris in the days after the disappearance. She said she found it odd that he seemed calm. When she saw news coverage that Shanann was pregnant, she said she felt sick. She realized he had hidden the pregnancy from her. She called the Weld County Sheriff's Office the same day. Agents asked Chris if he had told Nicole about the murders. He said no. He said she had nothing to do with it. Investigators never found any evidence to suggest otherwise. One of the final questions posed to Chris during the February interview was what he would say to his daughters if he could. He paused for nearly a minute, then said, "I'm sorry. I should have never done it. I should have never let it get to that point." In the years since the murders, the Saratoga Trail House has remained vacant. Several foreclosure auctions have been scheduled but delayed. Neighbors have moved away. Others have said they still see toys in the backyard. The home's windows are covered from the inside. Shanann's parents, Frank and Sandra Razusek, filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Chris in Weld County District Court. On November 19, 2019, the court awarded them $6 million in damages, $4 million for the wrongful deaths of Shanann, Bella, and Celeste, and $2 million for the emotional distress. Chris never contested the ruling. The judgment ensures that he cannot profit in any way from the case, not through books, interviews, or media deals. In a statement to the court, Frank Razusek said that he forgave Chris but would never forget what he had taken from them. He said that the silence in their home now was unbearable, that every photo reminded them of what was lost. Sandra Razusek said she prayed for her daughter and grandchildren every day. She said she still wakes up hoping it was all a mistake. Chris remains incarcerated in Wisconsin, serving 5 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. He has no access to the general prison population. He is allowed 2 hours outside his cell each day. According to a report by the Wisconsin Department of Corrections, he has received no major disciplinary violations. He has not requested any appeals. In his final interview, when asked what he thought his legacy would be, Chris answered quietly, "A monster." He said he didn't expect anyone to remember anything else. The case has left a deep scar not just on the Razusek family but on the thousands who followed the story from the beginning. The image of a smiling husband and father standing on his porch, pretending to search for the family he had already buried, remains one of the most haunting moments in the history of American true crime. You and I. We may never understand what allows someone to carry out such quiet destruction. There is no closure in a story like this. Only the long, echoing silence left behind in its wake. Story 7. The Luca Magnotta Case. On May 29, 2012, a brown cardboard box was delivered to the national headquarters of the Conservative Party of Canada in Ottawa. It was addressed to the party with no return address. The box sat on the floor among the usual piles of letters and parcels, one of many packages received that day. But when a staff member opened it, they recoiled immediately. Inside was a severed human foot, partially decomposed, wrapped in plastic and soaked through with blood. The stench was overpowering. Within hours, a second package was intercepted at a Canada Post processing facility. This one was addressed to the Liberal Party. Inside was a human hand also decomposing. Both packages had been mailed from Montreal. Police were alerted immediately. The RCMP and Ottawa police rushed to investigate, while Montreal authorities were contacted to trace the origin. Inside the packages, investigators found a note written in red ink claiming more body parts had been distributed and threatening the Prime Minister. The letters were cryptic and disturbing, signed with the pseudonym, Roger. As investigators in Ottawa tried to make sense of what they were seeing, a grim discovery was made nearly 200 kilometers away in Montreal. On May 29th, shortly before 10 in the morning, building manager Eric Schur entered apartment number 208 at 5720 Decory Boulevard, a small studio in a nondescript building in the Snowden neighborhood. Tenants complained of a foul odor coming from the unit, and flies had begun to gather at the windows. Schur unlocked the door and stepped inside. The lights were off. The air was thick with the stench of decay. In the corner of the room, beside an old mattress, was a suitcase. It was stained and bloated. Schur called the police. When officers arrived and opened the suitcase, they found a human torso inside, male, headless and limbless. Blood had seeped into the floor. A mattress in the room was soaked with it. Nearby, a poster of the movie Casablanca hung crooked on the wall. There were traces of bleach, a kitchen knife, and a small circular saw. Blood splatter analysis indicated that a violent act had taken place in the room and that someone had attempted to clean it up afterward. Montreal police quickly connected the dots. The body parts being mailed across the country were from the same victim. The torso in the suitcase matched the pieces found in Ottawa. The packages had been sent from a post office near the apartment building. Surveillance footage from the lobby confirmed that a man believed to be the tenant had entered the building days earlier, dragging several large bags. But he had not been seen since. The tenant's name was Luca Magnotta. Magnotta, born Eric Newman in 2002, was a Canadian born in Scarborough, Ontario. He had legally changed his name in 2006. Public records showed a history of minor fraud charges and a string of failed modeling and acting attempts. He had appeared in low-budget adult films and made repeated efforts to insert himself into the public eye by auditioning for reality shows and engaging with tabloid press. But investigators realized this case went much deeper. In the days before the discovery, a disturbing video had surfaced online. Titled "One Lunatic, One Ice Pick," the video showed a man tied to a bed, struggling, while another man believed to be Magnata stabbed him repeatedly with what appeared to be an ice pick, before dismembering the body and engaging in deeply disturbing acts with the remains. The video was posted to a gore site and quickly spread before moderators removed it. Some internet users had reported the video to police days before the body was found, but no action had been taken. Investigators confirmed that the victim in the video was the same man found in the suitcase. Forensic analysis and tattoo identification soon revealed the victim's identity. His name was Jun Lin, a 33-year-old international student from China, studying computer science at Concordia University in Montreal. Jun Lin had last been seen on May 24th, when he met with a man through a personal ad. Roommates reported him missing the next day when he failed to return home. His cat was left unfed, something he never did. Jun Lin's family had not yet been notified when the media began releasing details. His background was clean, a quiet, hardworking student with no enemies. He had moved to Canada in 2011 and was known for being polite, punctual, and private. The brutality of his death shocked those who knew him. There was no known connection between him and Luca Magnata, other than a brief online exchange. As police searched the apartment, they found blood traces leading to the bathtub and drain. A blood-stained bed frame had been discarded in the alley dumpster behind the building. Surveillance footage showed Magnata leaving the building multiple times in the days after the killing, sometimes wearing different clothes, sometimes carrying bags. He had checked out of the apartment on May 25th. But by the time authorities made the connection, Magnata was gone. Montreal police issued a Canada-wide arrest warrant on May 30th and asked Interpol to place Magnata on their most wanted list. The charges included first-degree murder, committing an indignity to a human body, and using the mail to send obscene material. The manhunt began. Magnata had carefully planned his exit. On May 26th, he boarded a flight from Montreal to Paris using his own passport. Surveillance footage at the airport showed him passing through security clean-shaven, wearing a white t-shirt and jeans. He carried a small bag and blended in easily. French police began tracing his movements. He had stayed at a hotel in Bagnolet, a suburb of Paris, before disappearing again. He left behind several items: pornographic magazines, air freshener cans, and receipts. His trail led to a second hotel, then to an apartment where he was believed to have stayed briefly. Witnesses reported seeing him in gay bars in the city. He had used multiple aliases, including Kirk Trammell and Jimmy, and was buying prepaid SIM cards to avoid detection. Interpol issued a red notice, their highest alert, and shared Magnata's details with police across Europe. Meanwhile, back in Canada, public reaction was one of horror and disbelief. The case dominated headlines. A manhunt stretched across continents. The media dubbed Magnata the Butcher of Montreal. Police received hundreds of tips, some helpful, others not. The video, though removed, had been seen by enough people to create a chilling profile of the suspect. He was methodical, narcissistic, and appeared to crave attention. Magnata had long cultivated an online persona. He had created dozens of fake Facebook profiles, fan pages, and forums dedicated to himself. He often posted under different aliases, praising his own looks or spreading rumors that he was dating celebrities. In 2010, he had been linked to a series of disturbing videos showing kittens being killed on camera, crimes that animal rights activists had tried to report to police, but with little success. The killer's identity had remained unconfirmed at the time. Now, many believe those videos were the precursor to what he had finally done. In the days after the discovery of Jun Lin's body, public outrage grew. A candlelight vigil was held outside Concordia University. His classmates wept. His family, still in China, was informed and began making arrangements to come to Canada. The university offered grief counseling, and politicians condemned the act as one of the most disturbing crimes in Canadian history. But the question remained, where was Luca Magnotta now? That answer would come from an unexpected place, a small internet cafe in Berlin, Germany. On June 4th, a sharp-eyed employee at the cafe recognized Magnotta from the international news coverage. He was sitting alone, reading news articles about himself. The employee quietly alerted police. When Berlin officers arrived, they asked him for identification. He gave a false name at first, but when pressed, he said, "You got me." Luca Magnotta was arrested without incident. When Luca Magnotta was taken into custody inside the internet cafe in Berlin's Neukölln district, German authorities acted swiftly. He was detained under the name Rocco Magnotta, one of several aliases he'd used across Europe. On him, police found identity documents, a laptop, and several pieces of luggage. Inside the bags were clothing, a German cell phone, and flight stubs suggesting that he had traveled from Paris to Berlin by bus just days earlier. At the time of his arrest, Magnotta offered no resistance. He appeared calm and compliant. According to the cafe employee who had recognized him, Magnotta had been reading articles about himself on news websites when police arrived. He had reportedly been living in hostels around the city, paying in cash and avoiding prolonged contact with other guests. Surveillance images later confirmed his movements through Berlin's Sudkreuz and Alexanderplatz stations, where he'd been seen traveling alone, carrying a large bag. Magnotta's arrest marked the end of a week-long international manhunt. German authorities held him at the Tegel prison, while Canadian officials prepared an extradition request. It was the first time in Canadian history that a suspect was placed on Interpol's most wanted list and captured abroad so quickly. On June 5th, Canadian investigators, including members of the Montreal Police Major Crimes Unit, traveled to Berlin to begin formal extradition proceedings. Back in Montreal, the investigation continued to deepen. Forensic teams combed through Magnotta's rented apartment, analyzing trace evidence and digital devices left behind. His laptop, seized from the scene, contained downloaded copies of the snuff video along with deleted searches for body disposal methods, international mailing restrictions, and necrophilia. Investigators retrieved browser histories showing that Magnotta had researched famous murderers and had read extensively about media coverage of serial killers. Meanwhile, forensic pathology reports confirmed what investigators had feared. June Lin's injuries were extensive and inflicted while he was still alive. The autopsy revealed multiple sharp force injuries consistent with an ice pick and knife, as well as evidence of strangulation. Toxicology analysis returned negative for sedatives, indicating that Lin had likely been conscious at the time of the initial attack. The dismemberment had occurred post-mortem, but the brutality of the killing was deliberate and prolonged. Canadian Postal Services, working in tandem with police, continued to intercept additional packages. On June 5th, a parcel containing June Lin's other foot was discovered at a Canada Post facility in Vancouver. It was addressed to a private elementary school, False Creek Elementary. 2 days later, a second package, this time containing the remaining hand, was located en route to St. George's School, another Vancouver institution. Both parcels had been mailed from Montreal. The choice of recipients appeared random. Neither of the schools had any connection to Magnotta or June Lin. The packages had been mailed in the days immediately following the killing, suggesting a calculated effort to prolong fear and confusion. Each parcel contained handwritten notes, much like the first ones, referencing government institutions, cryptic threats, and lines from horror films. The handwriting was matched to samples recovered from Magnotta's apartment, confirming authorship. In the days following the arrest, June Lin's parents arrived in Canada. His father, Darren Lin, gave a quiet and emotional statement to the press, thanking authorities and expressing grief on behalf of the family. With the assistance of Concordia University and the Chinese consulate, arrangements were made for a private memorial service. The university established a scholarship fund in June Lin's name, honoring his academic commitment and the tragedy of his death. As the legal process moved forward, Canadian prosecutors coordinated with German authorities for Magnotta's return. On June 18th, a Canadian military aircraft was dispatched to Berlin. Security was tight. 2 Montreal police officers accompanied Magnotta aboard a government Challenger jet, a rare move that underscored the high-profile nature of the case. Commercial airlines had refused to transport him due to concerns over passenger safety and media exposure. He arrived at Montreal's Mirabel Airport on June 18 under heavy escort. From there, he was transferred to the Rivière des Prairies detention center, placed in isolation pending trial. Police immediately executed a new series of search warrants targeting his online activity, including servers in the United States and Europe. Investigators were attempting to trace how the murder video had been uploaded and whether others had participated in its distribution. Digital forensic experts uncovered a pattern. The video had been uploaded to a site hosted in the Netherlands. Metadata embedded in the file showed it had been created on May 25, the same day June Lin was last seen. The video's timestamp confirmed that it had been edited and rendered before being uploaded, suggesting premeditation. Authorities also discovered several unreleased images on Magnata's devices, screenshots from the video, staged photographs of the crime scene, and selfies taken with the victim's remains. Attention also turned to Magnata's online footprint. He had maintained dozens of email accounts, social media profiles, and forum logins. Some of the accounts had been used to spread rumors about himself, including false claims that he was dating high-profile celebrities or being targeted by the government. One particular account had been active on the Best Gore website where the snuff video first appeared. Investigators confirmed that Magnata had used a proxy server to upload the footage, attempting to mask his location. A deeper look into his past revealed troubling patterns. In 2005, Magnata had been convicted in Toronto of fraud after impersonating a woman to obtain credit under her name. He received a conditional sentence of 9 months and probation. During this period, he underwent psychiatric evaluation. Court records from that time cited a diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia, though no long-term treatment plan was ever confirmed. Family members described him as increasingly erratic in the years that followed. His mother, Anna Yurkin, told police that he had become distant and obsessed with fame. He frequently expressed a belief that he was being followed or manipulated by unseen forces. In online posts, he hinted at government conspiracies, staged identity crises, and a desire to disappear. A friend from Toronto later told investigators that Magnata had once spoken of moving to Europe to start over and become someone people would never forget. Police also re-examined the animal cruelty allegations that had surfaced in 2010. Activist groups had identified Magnata as the man behind a series of kitten-killing videos, but despite mounting evidence, formal charges were never filed at the time. The failure to act on those warnings became a point of national discussion, with lawmakers and public figures calling for reforms in animal abuse investigations and internet crime reporting. As prosecutors prepared for trial, they faced a difficult task, proving not only that Magnata had committed the murder, but that he had done so with full awareness of his actions. His defense team, led by Luc Leclerc, signaled early on that they would pursue a not criminally responsible defense, citing mental illness. In response, the Crown assembled a panel of forensic psychiatrists to evaluate Magnata's state of mind both before and after the killing. The evaluations were complex. On the one hand, Magnata had demonstrated meticulous planning. He had purchased the tools used in the murder days in advance, rented an apartment under an alias, and distributed the body in a calculated manner. On the other hand, his long history of psychiatric diagnoses and delusional behavior could not be ignored. The court would ultimately have to decide whether he was capable of understanding the moral and legal consequences of his actions. As pre-trial hearings began in early 2013, the public was barred from seeing the full contents of the snuff video. The judge ruled that only the jury, legal teams, and court officers would view it in full, citing the extreme nature of the footage. Portions of the trial were placed under publication bans to protect the dignity of the victim and preserve the integrity of the proceedings. Outside the courtroom, the atmosphere was one of quiet anticipation. Reporters camped out each morning, while members of June Lin's family arrived under escort. They sat silently through the hearings, eyes fixed forward, listening to the legal arguments unfold. At no point did Magnata address the court directly. He sat behind bulletproof glass, expressionless, flanked by 2 guards. Occasionally, he made notes on a yellow pad, but mostly he remained still. The trial date was set for the fall of 2014. It would last 12 weeks and involve over 60 witnesses, hundreds of exhibits, and hours of graphic testimony. The Crown would argue that Magnotta had killed June Lin with full intent and awareness, driven by a desire for notoriety. The defense would argue that he was in the grip of a psychotic episode, incapable of understanding the reality of what he had done. But before the trial could begin, one final twist would emerge: a handwritten letter, discovered in a textbook inside Magnotta's storage locker. It was addressed to no one in particular, dated months before the killing. In it, he wrote of a plan to become infamous, of a video that would shock the world. The letter was signed with the same pseudonym used in the mailed packages, Roger. And as the evidence mounted, it became increasingly clear that this was no impulsive act, but the result of years of obsession, delusion, and a chilling desire to be remembered. The trial of Luca Magnotta began on September 29, 2014, inside the Quebec Superior Court in Montreal. Presided over by Justice Guy Cournoyer, the proceedings were expected to last up to 12 weeks. The courtroom was tightly controlled: no cameras, no audio recordings, and strict limitations on what could be publicly released. Media presence was high, but so too was the court's insistence on dignity for the victim and due process for the accused. From the first day, Magnotta pleaded not guilty to all 5 charges: first-degree murder, committing an indignity to a human body, publishing obscene materials, criminally harassing Prime Minister Stephen Harper and other members of Parliament, and mailing obscene and indecent materials. His defense lawyer, Luc Leclerc, did not dispute that Magnotta had killed June Lin. Instead, he argued that Magnotta was suffering from schizophrenia and was therefore not criminally responsible. The Crown, led by prosecutor Louis Bouthelier, asserted that this was a calculated and premeditated killing, not the result of a psychotic break. The prosecution's position was that Magnotta had orchestrated every detail from the online meeting to the filming and distribution of the video with full awareness of his actions. The jury, composed of 8 women and 6 men, was selected carefully. Each juror was warned about the disturbing nature of the evidence they would be required to see and hear. They were sequestered during video screenings and given support resources throughout the trial due to the psychological toll the case was expected to take. The opening weeks were dominated by forensic testimony. Multiple pathologists, crime scene analysts, and digital evidence experts outlined the sequence of events. Blood pattern analysis confirmed that June Lin had been killed in the bedroom of Magnotta's apartment. The mattress, removed and discarded in a trash pile behind the building, had absorbed most of the blood loss. The walls had been partially wiped down, though traces remained visible under luminol. DNA tests confirmed the blood belonged solely to June Lin. The forensic pathologist who performed the autopsy testified that June Lin had died from a combination of sharp and blunt force injuries, with signs of asphyxiation. The dismemberment had occurred after death. The body parts mailed across Canada had been preserved in plastic and packaging tape, placed in boxes with handwritten notes and symbols. The torso had been left in a suitcase, infested with maggots by the time it was found. Digital forensics experts walked the jury through Magnotta's online activity in the weeks leading up to the killing. He had made dozens of searches involving cannibalism, snuff films, necrophilia, and serial killers. He had also researched mailing procedures for packages, including how long it would take for parcels to travel from Montreal to Ottawa and Vancouver. On May 25th, the day June Lin was last seen, Magnotta had accessed a series of websites related to video editing and file sharing. Metadata obtained from his laptop confirmed that the video depicting the murder had been edited using Windows Movie Maker and was rendered at approximately 4 a.m. that morning. A second video, never released to the public, was recovered from his hard drive and entered into evidence. It showed additional footage of Magnotta with June Lin's remains, which had not been included in the original upload. The jury was shown only portions of the video under controlled conditions. Court officers stood by throughout the viewing. Several jurors looked away. One asked for a break. The footage was described by media present in court as among the most disturbing ever shown in a Canadian criminal trial. June Lin's personal belongings were also entered into evidence. His wallet, ID, and clothing had been found in the trash outside Magnotta's apartment building. His cell phone had been dismantled, with parts disposed of in different locations. The last text messages sent from his phone were to friends indicating he was meeting someone that evening. Surveillance footage from Concordia University and local convenience stores placed him in the neighborhood shortly before he entered Magnotta's building. The prosecution then shifted focus to Magnotta's behavior after the murder. Witnesses from the airline industry confirmed that he had purchased a one-way ticket to Paris under his legal name. At the airport, he had passed through security without incident. His luggage had not been flagged. Surveillance footage showed him moving calmly through the terminal. In Paris, Magnotta had used multiple aliases to check into hotels. Receipts showed he had purchased air fresheners and plastic bags. He had withdrawn cash from ATMs using cards still registered under his name. At one point, he visited an internet cafe and accessed news articles about the manhunt. French police located a discarded SIM card registered to a fake identity used by Magnotta. He had attempted to buy a prepaid phone using the name Kirk Trammell, a reference to a character from the film Basic Instinct. German police officers who arrested Magnotta in Berlin were flown to Montreal to testify. They described how he had been cooperative upon arrest, offering no resistance. He had provided his real name only after initial hesitation. At the time of his arrest, he was in possession of a German cell phone and foreign currency. He had been living in hostels and internet cafes, avoiding permanent accommodations. The defense then began calling expert witnesses to support the claim of diminished responsibility. Psychiatrist Dr. Marie-France Rivard testified that Magnotta had been diagnosed with schizophrenia in his early 20s and had experienced multiple psychotic episodes. She described a history of hospitalizations and disorganized thinking. According to her assessment, Magnotta had been in a state of psychosis at the time of the killing and could not appreciate the nature or quality of his actions. Another psychiatrist, Dr. Joel Watts, testified that Magnotta displayed signs of grandiosity, paranoia, and delusional behavior. He pointed to Magnotta's belief that he was being followed by government agents and that he was the target of a conspiracy. Dr. Watts concluded that Magnotta was suffering from schizophrenia and could not form the intent required for first-degree murder. However, the Crown's psychiatric experts offered a different perspective. Dr. Gillis Chamberlain testified that while Magnotta had a history of mental illness, he was capable of understanding his actions and knew they were wrong. Dr. Chamberlain emphasized Magnotta's planning, his efforts to conceal the crime, and his calculated escape from the country, all signs of rational decision-making. The prosecution also introduced a letter found in Magnotta's locker, dated weeks before the murder, in which he wrote about his desire to make a movie that would be talked about for years. The note referenced dismemberment and mailing body parts. This, they argued, was clear evidence of premeditation. The jury deliberated for 8 days. On December 23, 2014, they returned their verdict. Luca Magnotta was found guilty on all 5 counts. There was no visible reaction from him as the verdict was read. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for 25 years. The additional charges carried sentences to be served concurrently. He was transferred to the Port Cartier Institution, a maximum security prison in Quebec's Côte Nord region. Junlin's father addressed the court in a victim impact statement. He spoke through a translator, describing the deep sorrow his family had endured. He said that no punishment could bring back his son, but that justice had been served. His closing words were a quiet plea for peace for his son, for his family, and for the country that had become his son's home. In the aftermath, questions remained about how warning signs had been missed. Animal rights groups renewed calls for stronger legislation after learning of Magnotta's earlier online videos. Internet vigilantes who had tracked Magnotta for years expressed frustration that their concerns had not been taken seriously. Canadian lawmakers debated reforms to laws involving online abuse, mental illness, and the distribution of graphic content. The case left a lasting scar. A memorial plaque was installed at Concordia University. The scholarship in Junlin's name continued to receive donations. His ashes were returned to China, where his family held a private ceremony. Magnotta remains in prison and has since married another inmate, a man convicted of murder. He has filed multiple requests for transfer and accommodations, including for protective custody and media access, though most have been denied. No appeals have succeeded, and so the story ends not with justice that restores, but with a life extinguished and a country left to reflect on the horrors that can grow in silence, when signs are ignored, and when obsession festers unchecked. Jun Lin came to Canada to learn, to build a future, to live quietly. Instead, he became a name whispered in courtrooms, mourned in candlelight, and remembered by strangers who never knew him but wished they had. Story 8. The Bega Schoolgirl Murders. On the afternoon of Friday, October 3rd, 1997, Lauren Barry and Nicole Collins were walking home from a birthday party in the small town of Bega, located on the southeast coast of New South Wales, Australia. Lauren was 14 and Nicole was 16. The two had been friends for years, often seen together at school and around the neighborhood. That afternoon was supposed to be uneventful. They had attended a small gathering for a classmate and were making their way back to Lauren's house. It was a short walk, just a few kilometers through quiet streets and back roads. But they never made it home. At first, it didn't raise alarms. It wasn't unusual for teenagers to stop somewhere along the way, maybe visit another friend or linger at a park. But as the evening hours passed and no one heard from them, concern began to grow. Lauren's parents, who expected her home before dark, started calling around. When it turned out no one had seen them since the party, they contacted the police. The initial police reaction was cautious. Officers treated the case as a probable teenage runaway situation. It was a common assumption, especially with girls around that age. They figured the girls had decided to stay out longer than they were allowed, maybe even taken off for a bit of adventure. But their families insisted this wasn't like them. Both girls were responsible, involved in school, and close with their families. Neither had packed bags, and both had left their belongings behind. By the next morning, when there was still no sign of them, police began to treat the disappearance more seriously. A search was launched. Officers and volunteers combed the area between the party location and Lauren's home. Helicopters flew overhead, and nearby residents were questioned. Local roads were checked, but there was nothing, no signs of a struggle, no discarded items, nothing to suggest where they had gone. Then, a few days into the investigation, a disturbing witness account came in. A teenage boy who had been at the same party as Lauren and Nicole told police he'd seen them last walking along North Bega Road. Not long after, he saw a white sedan slowly driving behind them. He didn't recognize the car at the time, but the way it crawled along the road, trailing behind the girls, stuck in his mind. He thought maybe they knew the driver. That car would later be identified as a white Holden Commodore owned by Leslie Camilleri. Camilleri was not from Bega. He lived in Yass, over 500 kilometers away, and had a long criminal history. By 1997, he had accumulated more than 200 prior convictions, including offenses for theft, burglary, and drug possession. He was also known to associate with another man, Lindsay Beckett, a 23-year-old with his own troubled background. Beckett was quieter, less known to police, but the two were often together. Camilleri and Beckett weren't in Bega for any particular reason. They had driven there on a whim, bored and looking for something to do. What they found instead were two teenage girls walking home alone just after dusk. According to later court records and Beckett's confession, Camilleri spotted Lauren and Nicole first and suggested they follow them. As they pulled up alongside the girls, Camilleri rolled down the window and offered them a lift. When the girls declined, the situation turned violent. Camilleri got out of the car and forced them in at knife point. Beckett helped. From that point on, Lauren and Nicole were captives. They were driven for hours first north, then inland deep into unfamiliar territory. The girls were terrified, but they didn't know yet what the men had planned. Camilleri and Beckett took them to a remote location near Fiddler Green Creek in the rugged countryside of Torang, just outside Goulburn. There, over the next several hours, both girls were subjected to prolonged sexual assault and physical violence. They were tied up, threatened, and told that if they tried to escape, they would be killed. At some point during the night, the men decided they needed to move again. They feared getting caught and thought they were too close to populated areas. So they loaded the girls back into the car and drove further into the wilderness, this time to a pine plantation near the town of Bangadang in Victoria across the state border. The trip took hours. During the drive, both girls remained bound, terrified, and unsure of what would come next. Camilleri and Beckett alternated between mocking them and threatening them with death. Lauren and Nicole tried to stay calm, hoping someone would notice the car or that they'd be rescued, but no one knew where they were. The final destination was a dense, isolated area far from any homes, gas stations, or passing traffic. It was here, after more than 24 hours of captivity, that the situation took its most brutal turn. Camilleri decided they needed to get rid of the girls. He worried they had seen too much, that they could identify them. Beckett later told investigators that Camilleri was the one who made that decision. He said he didn't want to go along with it, but Camilleri was older, more dominant, and had threatened him too. As morning broke on Sunday, October 5th, the girls were led out of the car under the false promise they would be let go. Lauren was taken into the trees first. Beckett was told to stay with Nicole. A few minutes later, Camilleri returned alone. Then he took Nicole. Both girls were murdered in the forest. According to forensic evidence and Beckett's own later statements, they were strangled with wire and their bodies were left hidden among the trees. Camilleri and Beckett then drove off, leaving behind no obvious trace. Back in Bega, the families of Lauren and Nicole were still desperate for answers. Posters went up around town. News outlets picked up the story. Interviews with the girls' parents were aired on national television. Police expanded the search area, but without any leads or evidence, the investigation stalled. That changed almost a month later on November 12th when Lindsay Beckett walked into a police station in Victoria and confessed. He told detectives everything. How they had abducted the girls, where they took them, what they did, and where the bodies could be found. Police immediately launched a search of the Bangadang area. The next day, the remains of Lauren Barry and Nicole Collins were discovered in the forest, just as Beckett had described. Both girls had been dead for more than 5 weeks. Their bodies were badly decomposed, but forensic teams were able to confirm their identities. The discovery brought a mix of relief and devastation to their families. The search was over, but not in the way anyone had hoped. Camilleri was arrested shortly after. Unlike Beckett, he denied any involvement. He blamed Beckett for everything, claiming he'd been asleep during parts of the trip and didn't know what had happened. But forensic evidence, witness statements, and Beckett's confession painted a different picture. The case of the Bega schoolgirl murders would go on to horrify the nation. It raised serious questions about how two known criminals could roam freely, abduct children, and cross state lines without being stopped. It also exposed flaws in the early police response and the difficulty of tracking offenders across jurisdictions. But at its heart, it was the story of two young girls who had trusted they were safe walking home in their own town and the unimaginable horror they faced instead. When Lindsay Beckett turned himself in to Victoria Police on November 12, 1997, investigators had no reason to suspect what was coming. He was quiet when he entered the station, requesting to speak with a detective. Officers led him into an interview room, expecting perhaps a confession about a local burglary or a drug issue. But what he said next shifted the entire direction of the Bega missing persons case. He told them he had been involved in the abduction and murder of two schoolgirls from New South Wales. The detective in the room, stunned by the admission, asked him to start from the beginning. Over the next several hours, Beckett spoke in slow, halting detail. He explained that in the early evening of October 3rd, he and Leslie Camilleri had spotted two girls walking along a road near Bega. He admitted they had forced them into the vehicle at knife point, driven them across state lines, and ultimately killed them in a remote plantation near the Victorian border. His account was chilling, but it also held specific details only someone involved could know. He gave the names of the victims, the locations they had stopped, and finally, the precise area where the bodies had been left. That information hadn't been made public. Victoria Police immediately contacted their counterparts in New South Wales. A joint task force was formed, and that same day, detectives accompanied Beckett to the pine plantation in Bangadang. As they approached the area, Beckett pointed toward a clearing off the main track. He directed officers to two separate locations among the trees. There, partially concealed beneath branches and forest debris, were the remains of Lauren Barry and Nicole Collins. Forensics were brought in to confirm identity and examine the scene. The girls' bodies were found separately but within close proximity. Both were clothed, though the condition of their clothing and the state of decomposition made it difficult to establish the full extent of injuries immediately. Forensic pathologists later determined both had died from strangulation using wire. No attempt had been made to bury them. The crime scene was processed meticulously. Investigators recovered strands of wire, fibers, and tire tracks consistent with the vehicle Beckett and Camilleri had used. Soil samples were taken and photos documented every detail. The area was remote with no nearby residences or traveled roads. It was clear the killers had chosen the location carefully. Back at the station, Beckett continued to cooperate. He provided a full statement, naming Leslie Camilleri as the one who orchestrated the abduction and directed the killings. He described Camilleri's behavior during the ordeal as manipulative, violent, and controlling. According to Beckett, Camilleri had insisted on silencing the girls permanently out of fear they would go to the police. The next day, New South Wales detectives traveled to Yass to apprehend Camilleri. He was arrested without incident and taken into custody for questioning. Unlike Beckett, Camilleri refused to confess. From the outset, he denied any involvement. He claimed he had merely been driving around with Beckett, unaware of what had occurred. He said Beckett must have acted alone, possibly when he had fallen asleep in the car. This claim was quickly dismantled. Police had already recovered evidence from Camilleri's white Holden Commodore, including fibers, fingerprints, and DNA belonging to both Lauren and Nicole. Surveillance and witness sightings placed the car in the region during the time frame of the abduction. Furthermore, Beckett's testimony included specific details that aligned with forensic findings: the use of wire, the movement of the car across state lines, and the sequence of events at the plantation. As the investigation continued, detectives also uncovered a disturbing pattern in Camilleri's past. Though he had never previously been charged with homicide, his criminal record included over 200 convictions. Many were for property crimes, but a number involved violence and threats against women. He had spent much of his life in and out of juvenile detention centers and later adult prisons. At the time of the murders, Camilleri was on parole. The parole conditions required him to remain in New South Wales and report regularly to authorities. But no one had noticed when he failed to check in. There was no alert system in place to track his movements across state lines. This revelation prompted widespread criticism of the parole system and raised questions about how someone with such a record could avoid detection for so long. Meanwhile, grief settled over Bega like a heavy fog. The small town, home to just a few thousand residents, was known more for its dairy farms and quiet streets than for violent crime. The news that Lauren and Nicole had been found murdered hundreds of kilometers away shocked both the local community and the wider country. Candlelight vigils were held at their school and flowers lined the fences near their homes. Strangers sent letters of condolence and neighbors stood silently beside the families, unsure what to say. Lauren Barry's parents, Cheryl and Peter, did not speak publicly at first. Neither did Nicole Collins' mother, Robin, but those close to them described the families as shattered. They had spent weeks hoping for good news, clinging to the belief the girls had simply run off. The reality was worse than anything they could have imagined. In the weeks after the arrests, prosecutors began preparing the case. Both men were charged with 2 counts of murder, as well as multiple counts of abduction, sexual assault, and aggravated assault. They were to be tried separately. The decision was made to offer Beckett a reduced sentence in exchange for his full cooperation and testimony against Camilleri. As part of the plea deal, Beckett agreed to plead guilty to both murders. In return, he would avoid a life sentence without parole. This decision was not without controversy. Many in the public believed both men deserved the harshest penalty possible. But prosecutors argued that without Beckett's confession, the bodies might never have been found and justice never served. In court, Beckett appeared subdued and remorseful. He did not contest the charges. His statement to the court included an admission of guilt and an apology to the families, though many questioned its sincerity. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a non-parole period of 35 years. Camilleri's case was different. He maintained his innocence throughout the trial. His defense team argued that Beckett had staged the entire crime and falsely implicated him. They claimed there was no direct evidence linking Camilleri to the murders themselves, but the prosecution presented a compelling case. They introduced forensic evidence showing the presence of both victims in Camilleri's car as well as timeline analysis of their movements. More damning still was Beckett's testimony. He took the stand and described in detail how Camilleri had controlled the events from beginning to end. The jury deliberated for several days before returning a verdict. Leslie Camilleri was found guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The courtroom was silent as the sentence was read. No reaction came from Camilleri, but in the gallery, the families of Lauren and Nicole sat together, holding hands. For them, it was not relief. It was finality. In the months that followed, media coverage of the case continued. Editorials criticized the parole system that had allowed Camilleri to remain free. Others questioned whether Beckett's sentence was too lenient. But above all, the focus remained on the two girls, their futures taken, their lives remembered in photographs and school awards, in the quiet streets of Bega where their absence was still felt with every passing day. The violence inflicted on them was not only physical. It left a scar on families, on communities, and on a nation still struggling to comprehend how such cruelty could emerge from the shadows of a country road. In the early months of 1998, as the court proceedings against Leslie Camilleri and Lindsay Beckett advanced, the full extent of what had happened to Lauren Barry and Nicole Collins became clear through forensic evidence, crime scene analysis, and courtroom testimony. The picture that emerged was not only one of unimaginable violence but of deliberate, sustained cruelty over the span of more than 30 hours. Forensic pathologists confirmed that both girls had been subjected to repeated sexual assaults during the time they were held captive. Bruising and lacerations consistent with restraints were found on their wrists and ankles, indicating they had been tied up for extended periods. The cause of death for both Lauren and Nicole was ligature strangulation using electrical wire. The wire was later recovered from the scene, partially buried under pine needles and forest debris. It had been cut into sections consistent with being used to bind or kill. The forensic team also found evidence of attempts to clean parts of the car's interior. Bleach residue was detected in the boot of the Holden Commodore, along with fibers matching clothing worn by the girls. DNA testing confirmed biological material belonging to both victims was present on the back seat and in the trunk. The state of decomposition had made certain details difficult to determine, but the findings were enough to corroborate Lindsay Beckett's account. During trial, Beckett testified that Lauren and Nicole had never been given a chance to escape. He said Camilleri kept them bound and blindfolded and issued threats throughout the ordeal, telling the girls they would be killed if they made noise or tried to run. Beckett described how Camilleri alternated between moments of eerie calm and bursts of rage, particularly when the girls asked to go home. According to Beckett, Camilleri would mock them, then fall silent for long stretches, staring out into the woods or pacing in the dark. The prosecution introduced audio recordings of Beckett's original police interview. In it, he spoke with a flat, numb tone, describing how Camilleri had ordered him to deal with the girls. Beckett claimed he initially protested but ultimately complied out of fear. He admitted to participating in the murders, stating he had strangled one of the girls while Camilleri dealt with the other. The details were cold and clinical but consistent with the physical evidence. Court documents later revealed that Camilleri had a history of manipulative behavior, particularly toward younger, more submissive individuals. Psychological assessments submitted during the trial portrayed him as possessing narcissistic and antisocial traits, with a marked lack of empathy. He had a history of blaming others for his actions, and had previously used younger accomplices to carry out various crimes. Beckett, who was 6 years younger and intellectually limited, appeared to have been one such target. During Camilleri's trial in the Supreme Court of Victoria, the jury was shown maps, photographs of the crime scenes, and diagrams of the girls' final known movements. Witnesses from Bega testified about seeing the white Holden Commodore trailing the girls. Forensic experts explained how the evidence in the car and at the site matched Beckett's testimony. The prosecution emphasized that the murders were not impulsive but calculated and cruel, carried out over a prolonged period and across several hundred kilometers. Camilleri chose not to testify in his own defense. His legal team argued that the evidence was circumstantial and that Beckett had motive to lie. They pointed to Beckett's plea deal and suggested he had crafted a story that minimized his own role. But the jury was unconvinced. The corroboration between Beckett's confession, forensic evidence, and the recovered bodies left little doubt as to what had occurred. On February 27, 1999, Camilleri was found guilty of 2 counts of murder, 2 counts of sexual assault, and 2 counts of abduction. Justice Frank Vincent, in delivering the sentence, stated that the crimes were among the worst kind imaginable and that Camilleri had robbed 2 families of their daughters in a manner that was both callous and depraved. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The court proceedings also revealed the failures in the parole system that had allowed Camilleri to remain at large. At the time of the murders, he was under parole supervision for prior convictions, including violent offenses. He had breached parole by leaving his designated area and failing to report to his officer. Yet no alert had been issued, and no attempts were made to locate him. A subsequent review by the New South Wales Department of Corrective Services led to a public apology to the families and a commitment to overhaul parts of the parole monitoring system. The aftermath of the case left deep scars across multiple communities. In Bega, memorials were held at the girls' school, where their classmates gathered to remember them. Teachers described Lauren as thoughtful, curious, and always willing to help, while Nicole was remembered for her sharp wit and strong sense of justice. Neither girl had any known contact with their killers prior to that night. They had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. The Barry and Collins families withdrew from public life in the months following the sentencing. Statements issued through legal representatives thanked the police and the public for their support but asked for privacy. Neither family attended interviews or spoke to the press in the years that followed. The trauma, by all accounts, was immeasurable. In the years after the trial, Camilleri remained incarcerated in Victoria. He was later transferred to the maximum security Bar 1 prison, where he was placed under strict supervision due to the nature of his offenses. In prison, he became the subject of further controversy when it was discovered that he had been in contact with other inmates involved in high-profile crimes. Authorities restricted his communications and moved him into protective custody after threats were made against him by other prisoners. Beckett, serving his sentence in New South Wales, was kept under observation due to concerns for his mental health. Psychiatrists who evaluated him during trial proceedings described him as having borderline intellectual functioning and a dependent personality. He had expressed regret during his sentencing, but the court had made clear that his remorse did not absolve him of responsibility. His earliest possible release date, under the terms of his sentence, would not come until the year 2033. The Bega schoolgirl murders became a case studied in both criminology and law enforcement circles in Australia. It highlighted the dangers posed by itinerant offenders, the importance of interstate police cooperation, and the need for more rigorous monitoring of parolees. It also prompted discussions about how vulnerable individuals can be manipulated into participating in crimes far beyond their comprehension or control. No memorial stands in the forest where Lauren and Nicole took their final breaths, but in Bega, a plaque was placed in the school courtyard where the girls once ate lunch together. It bears their names and the date they were last seen, surrounded by flowers planted by classmates and teachers who refused to let their memory fade. The case, though resolved in the legal sense, left behind a haunting silence, a reminder of how quickly innocence can be shattered and how deeply violence can reverberate through the lives of those left behind. For the families, for the town, and for those who followed the case, the story of Lauren Barry and Nicole Collins remains not just a tragedy, but a warning of what can happen when the systems meant to protect us fail. And in that quiet place between the pines and the darkened roads, the memory of 2 girls walking home from a birthday party lingers, forever unfinished.